皆さん、こんにちは。今日は、この S21 という研究プロジェクトが主催の公開イベントにご参加いただきましてありがとうございます。研究代表をしている IGES の斉藤です。For international guests, unfortunately, we cannot provide English translation this time. We only have the translation from Japanese to English. So those who are participating need translation. They're going to use the Zoom channel to get the Japanese translation, but there is no translation from Japanese to English. So, but for the other rest of the participants, I will speak in Japanese as a kind of the opening remarks. But please allow me, and I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. So, and I also prepare some of the English slides. So don't worry, you will not miss. では、スライドを使わせていただきたいと思います。なかなか出てこない。出てきました。ネイチャーポジティブということに関しましては、よく使われている図がこちらになりますけれども、2030年までに、生物多様性の損失を止めて、さらにそれをポジティブな方向に、転換させていくということで、国際的にも、定義されていて、一番有名な定義がここにある Nature Positive is Global Goal ということで、Halt and Reverse Nature を自然の、損失を30年までに止めて、2020年を比較してですね、2030年までにその損失を止めて、さらに最大限の回復というのを2050年までに図るということが求められております。で、それに向けていろんな取り組みが、されているということで、特に日本ではもうすでに、すみません。複数回にわたって生物多様性の国家戦略、前に戻らないんですけれども、こちらですね、生物多様性の国家戦略が見直しがされてきました。So Japan already renewed the NBSAP to capture the concept of nature positive. ということで、日本語では自然最高という形で、受け止められていますけれども、基本的に同じ定義で、その基本戦略の中でも明確に位置づけられていて、それを実現するというのが、最も重要な目標ということで位置づけられております。で、さらに、日本の場合には、これまで4つの危機があると、生物多様性に関して4つの危機があるというふうに言われています。で、最初の危機が開発や乱獲による種の減少、絶滅、生地の減少といったことが、まず第一の危機というふうに位置づけられていて、2番目の危機が、里山、里海なども含みますけれども、そういった、人間が手を入れて維持してきた自然ですね、半自然も含む、が、利用が低下して、それによって、生物多様性の質が劣化しているということが言われています。これが人口減少だったり、高齢化といったことと同時進行で起きているというのが特に日本では特徴的な課題と、危機として捉えられています。で、第3の危機が、外来種になって、第4の危機が地球環境による危機ということで、気候変動だったり、オーシャンアシディフィケーションということで、海洋酸性化といったところが重要な課題というふうに位置づけられております。そういった文脈の中で、2年前にですね、新しい研究プロジェクトを立ち上げました。5つのテーマからなっていまして、私以外にも4名の研究のテーマリーダーがやります。で、主な目的というのは、生物多様性に関して、統合的な、それを評価するためのモデルを作っていくということで、特にその中でも、重視していることというのが、気候変動、まずですね、生物多様性に関しては、それに対して危機の話をしました。危機というのが主に4つの危機というのは、 直接的な要因というふうに考えられます。で、その直接的な要因の背後に、間接的な、要因があります。So I mentioned four crises by biodiversity, but at the same time, behind the four crises, there is indirect drivers affecting those four crises. So this project also considered indirect drivers explicitly. So ということで、間接要因まで踏み込んだ研究、そしてそれを評価するためのモデル作りというのが、このプロジェクトの大きな目的の一つになっております。で、その中でもさらに、直接要因の中でも特に重要なのが、気候変動ということになります。4つ目の危機と。So, host crisis of climate change and how to achieve climate change target and biodiversity target simultaneously is also one of the key challenge for our project. ということで、気候変動と生物多様性の対策というのを同時に進めて、その中でシナジーを生み出していく。一方ではトレードオフ、気候変動対策と生物多様性対策の間で、どちらかを強化するとどちらかが弱まってしまうような、そういったことがないようなトレードオフを回避するということを、このプロジェクトの中では重要な課題というふうに位置づけています。で、3つ目が、クンミン、モントリオール生物多様性枠組み、GBF ですね、と言われているものですけれども、ここの目標の中でも特に30 by 30と呼ばれているような目標ですね、こういったものに対して、きちんと政策的な、提言ができるような研究を進めるというのが、重要な課題になっています。So, also the third point for our new project to meet international the targets including GBF ということで、それを目的として、既存の気候変動のための統合評価モデルを活用して、それを拡張する形で生物多様性、気候変動及びその他の社会経済的な要因を統合的に扱えるようなモデル開発というのを、5つの研究チームで進めております。実際にはその5つのチームの下にまたさらにサブチームがあるという構造になってまして、研究参加しているメンバー全体から言うと120から130名の研究者が参加しております。で、5つの研究の要素に関して、絵にしたものというのが、こちらはすみません、逆に英語のものを中心で、示していますので、日本語の、参加者の方には申し訳ないんですけれども、5つの、テーマの位置づけをですね、絵にしたものが次のスライドです。すみません。もうちょっとだけお待ちください。もう切り替わるはずです。で、テーマ3が主に統合評価モデルを作っていくところで、それを作った統合評価モデルを、地域、国スケールで展開する、実際にそれを評価に用いて、評価していくというのがテーマ4。テーマ5というのが、それを、地域サイトということで、南三陸、佐渡、それから、こちらですね、南三陸、このローカルスケールということで、南三陸と佐渡と大阪で、その統合的開発した統合評価モデルというのを、実際に適用して評価をすると。その関連で、実は今日のこの、公開イベントをやるのはなぜかと申し上げますと、実は南三陸という我々の研究サイトの一つに、前日まで現地視察に行ってきました。で、あと今回これを開催しているのは、実はそこの南三陸で、我々の研究プロジェクトでは国際的な、国際アドバイザリーボードというものを設定してまして、今日講演いただく、先生方にですね、アドバイザーとして、研究の進捗について説明をしてコメントいただくという形で、これまで、去年も実はオンラインでやったんですけども、それを今年はオンサイトで実際現場も見ていただきながら、やろうということで、昨日まで南三陸に行って現地を視察をしながらですね、実際に南三陸で昨日の午前中に国際アドバイザリーボード会合というのを行いまして、4時間を超える会議だったんですけれども、いろいろなご意見をいただいたという形になっております。で、せっかくそういった国際的にもですね、こういった活動、生物多様性分野での研究をリードしている、先生方がいらっしゃる、機会を使って、ぜひ 何かできないかということで企画したのが今回の公開イベントになっております。でこれがその視察の時の写真のいくつかです。I didn't include the sake over your drinking. ただ、海も見ましたし、山も見て、それで、あと里の方も見てということで、いろいろ視察をすることができたんですけど、たまたま昨日帰りに新幹線が強風で、止まってしまってですね、帰ってくるのに5時間ぐらいかかって、東京着いた時はもう11時近かったので、多分もう今日のスピーカーみんな多分非常に疲弊はしていると思うんですけれども、頑張って準備をしていただいてますので、ぜひ彼らの、講演について楽しんでいただければと思います。これが今日のプログラムになっております。私からはこういった形で、今日、これお見せするからですけれども、論点としてはこんなところを考えているということで、実は今日これ聞きながら多分この最後の部分は変わると思います。So I'm showing this one, but while I'm listening to your presentation, I may rearrange these points, but these are, pre-discussion point. So this ということで、私からの冒頭の挨拶、開催させていただきます。では、この後の講演をぜひ楽しんでいただければと思います。ありがとうございます。Okay, so I would like to invite Caroline as the first speaker. では、最初に、ニュージーランドからの、キャロラインさんに講演いただきます。よろしくお願いします。So, floor is yours.
Thank you.
This is
Kia kato katoa. My name is Carolyn Lundquist. I'm from Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm a member of the IPBES Multidisciplinary Expert Panel, as well as co-chair of our Scenarios and Models Task Force. And where I'm based in New Zealand is at both the University of Auckland, as well as our National Institute for Water and Atmospheric Research. Now, what I'm going to talk to you today about is a new tool that we've developed to help us identify new positive nature futures. Now, this tool is based on the values that we have for nature. But the question is, how do we bring the values that humans have for nature into the scenarios that our decision makers, the different things that they're developing to help manage our lands and seas? And so a lot of what we're doing with this tool is then how do we bring forward different nature positive futures that help identify transformative changes that we need to be doing, as well as helping to identify better ways that recognize that a lot of our material benefits that we get from nature may be degrading natural environments. And so how can we look at not just the material benefits that we get from nature, but also the diversity of other values and benefits that we have from nature? So for those of you that aren't familiar with IPBES, probably everyone here has heard of IPBES before, but maybe some of you online have not heard of IPBES. It's the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And to date, I believe IPBES it's been around since 2012. So it's a similar platform to IPCC, and it is just approved its 12th and 13th, I hope I have the numbers right, assessments. So one on the nexus and one on transformative change that were approved in December of this year at the plenary session in Namibia. But we also have a very early report that we had. So one of the first assessments was actually on scenarios and models and how we can use scenarios and models to better inform the way that we manage biodiversity and ecosystem services. And basically what we found was that, yes, biodiversity models, they are out there. We do use them, they're not as prevalent as possibly how familiar people are in financial markets or as well in climate change. But often we have biodiversity as kind of an output in other people's scenarios. And so one thing was then how do we then develop biodiversity specific or even nature positive scenarios? But and then making sure that we're bringing these new perspectives, these new ways of managing land and sea as really the direct management implications that are happening in the scenarios were developed, rather than managing, for example, for climate change, where we're looking at things like temperature and sea level rise, and then just modeling how those drivers impact on biodiversity. So rather, we want to change the way we do scenarios. So we're choosing what type of land or sea management that we're doing to better biodiversity and ecosystem services, and use that a bit more all-encompassing. The other thing that most scenario approaches don't have is that they often don't have participation. So they are very top-down. So the scenario experts develop the scenarios, they decide what things they want to model, but they often don't use those of us that are on the ground and might have ideas of what would work in a local context. From the last few days in Minami-San Rico, we learned lots of local initiatives that have had huge impacts since 2011 on how that particular city uses both forestry as well as the aquaculture in the region. And so lots of these things come up locally, and allowing for that participation of local people, local communities, as well as regional and central government into scenario processes can help identify a lot of new ideas. And I think Laura might talk about some different seeds in her presentation as well, but new positive ideas that maybe the experts might not have thought of. So we also know from other assessments, for example, this is showing our first global assessment, some of the figures from that, but we also have the new Nexus assessment. And the Nexus was basically showing, that was our 2024 December, one of the two assessments. And it showed how that we need to consider climate, biodiversity, water, energy, and food production all at the same time, because when we're only managing for one of those things, we're not actually getting good benefits across all those areas. And we need to be managing humans and nature together. And what this one is showing in these figures, each of the sets of blocks, there's an orange one that's biodiversity, a purple one that is provisioning ecosystem services like food and wood, timber, forestry, but also regulating services like climate change or pollination or nitrogen cycling. And you'll see that we have differences regionally as you look across the different groups, but also between three different scenarios that we had in terms of what they're providing. So we know we can look across scenarios and see if we do option one, we may get better crop pollination, but worse outcomes for other things like species richness. Probably not. You'd probably get both of those doing well at the same time. But we have ways of using our scenarios to look at, if we do this option, what things do well and what things don't do well. And then we can use that to see what are the best options that we can use in the future in the way we change our management of lands and oceans. So I mentioned values. Why are values important, and what are values? Well, when you first talk about nature values, when I mentioned that, probably the first thing you thought about was nature. And often when we think about nature, the only thing we think about is those, what we call intrinsic values. So values for nature as it is, our landscapes, our seascapes, our species. So here I have some pictures of a kakapo. That's one of our endangered flightless parrots in New Zealand, or the tuatara. It's a reptile, but not really a reptile, closer related to dinosaurs that we still have in New Zealand. Pane mahuta is about a 45-meter diameter tree. So that's a massive tree we have in New Zealand. But also landscapes and seascapes. Certainly we had some wonderful scenery that we got to see over the last few days, but also local restoration. That's actually my hometown urban gully restoration project, where we're planting seedlings. So lots of people then have nature just as nature for itself, restoring habitats, restoring places, ensuring we don't have extinction of endangered species. And again, those are what we often call intrinsic nature values. But we also have a lot of the things we call our ecosystem services or our instrumental or material nature values. Nature provides food and livelihoods. That's one of my favorite pictures up on the left. I don't like many pictures of myself, but that one is one with a couple of Dungeness crabs. It's a San Francisco crab that I grew up with. And that's something that we would have for special holidays with my family, where we'd go to the fish market, catch the crabs, and bring them in there. But it's a very San Francisco regional specialty and has a whole, obviously fishery around it. But we also have lots of other, agricultural products. That's some aquaculture. So we got to visit some mariculture. It was quite nice to see the very different types of aquaculture all in one place, whereas the picture there in New Zealand is just green lip mussels, just the one species. And I cheated. I put that's my pandemic garden, which actually did quite well on the top right there. But all of these things are what we get from nature supporting food and livelihoods associated with food production. There are other ecosystem services or other instrumental or material values that nature provides. And so some of these are things like nutrient recycling, sediment trapping from land. Here I've got this example of mangroves, carbon sequestration, habitat provisioning. So there are lots of things in this case often that nature provides for free. And so some early work that introduced the concept of ecosystem services in the 1990s helped us to then, in some cases, even quantify a lot of these ecosystem services so that people could realize the cost of losing the things that nature provides for humans. But finally, I have one third set of nature values, which are relational values. And people are familiar with these, but often don't see them in a policy or decision-making context. So nature is also part of our culture and who we are. So we do have nature values. I've got one of Yasuo's pictures up there, just for you. But so we have lots of indigenous cultures and knowledge systems where nature is very much part of cultural practices and knowledge sharing from across generations. Certainly in New Zealand, this is really part of our daily lives with our Maori culture, very much integrated across all aspects of New Zealand. But we also have that sense of identity, and experiential values that we have for nature. I have always pictures of my children in presentations. That's them quite a bit younger right here. They're now 16 and 18, and I'm sure they're horrified that I've included their pictures still. And that's those two a little bit younger. But often those of us that live in cities, the way we experience nature is when we go on holiday. So we go out on holiday, we see things, whether it's experiencing things like sheep. Again, I'm from New Zealand. We have lots of them. Or camping. This is one of our other task force members, Sylvia's pictures. I've got one of Gary's pictures in here. But there are lots of those values that we have for nature that you might struggle to see, how do we get these into decision making? But these are the things that we as humans value for nature, and often what gets us to make decisions on what we want to protect. So take those three types of values together, and here's the Nature Futures framework. We spent about 5 years developing this framework with work across lots of different stakeholder workshops and things. And what we came up with then has this triangular framework that has those relational values, the one with nature or nature's culture type values, intrinsic values, so nature for nature, and those societal values, the material or instrumental values. Now you'll see what also came out is this picture on the right. We have this little swirl, and that was something that came out of the IPBES plenary session as we were going through the approval process with governments. We had a lot of feedback from our indigenous knowledge systems, and they said, well, we don't separate the three types of values. For us, they're all really intertwined as one, and that whole goal of living in harmony with nature, that we really don't want to see the separation across instrumental or other values. So we have this dual Indigenous knowledge system version of the Nature Futures Framework, and the one on the left that's something that we're working on for developing many of the scenarios. And we're actually having a workshop next month with our Indigenous knowledge holders in the Philippines, where we're going to look at how do we better develop scenarios for Indigenous knowledge systems. So working on how do we make something that works with that, or something that might be a bit different depending on what type of process best suits them. So when we have this Nature Futures Framework, we have these different values, and we can use them to identify different nature positive futures. And some might be more focusing on values for the nature as culture, for nature for society, or for nature. And to give you an idea of how these can actually come up with quite different worlds, here are some drawings that we put together, putting examples of urban landscapes. And you can see all of these are nature positive futures, but they are based on different values that we have. So if we're trying to highlight nature for nature in developing cities, we might have very tall buildings and reduced footprints of our cities so that we have nature expanding around the city. But the key thing is we're building a city within the footprint of nature, not recreating or forcing nature to be constrained to what the city wants it to be. So you might see here, and that's something that we saw in Minami Sanrico, is we saw the new rebuild of the city then has a lot of more park and grassland in the front within kind of the main flooding type area, and the cities are built quite a bit further away. So recognizing the impacts that you might have. In New Zealand, we have lots of rainfall and flooding as well. So changing so that the city is built around nature and natural processes, such as seasonal flooding, rather than constraining nature to fit within the city's footprint. The one in the middle is an example of an urban city with nature's culture. And there it's very much creating the city around what reconnecting people with nature. So making sure that's access to things nearby in nature. So access to whether it's local streams or parks or things like that, and lots of green space throughout nature. And then the final one, we have our nature society, for example. So it's how do we use nature within the building of our cities? And many cities are actually doing these types of things already, whether it's things like rooftop gardens or roof walls. I've seen lots of these as I've traveled around the world, making, again, still green spaces, solar panels, windbreaks, planting trees for water or air purifying and things like that. So lots can be done in cities that are basically based on that nature for society value. But again, here, 3 sets of nature positive scenarios, but all based on focusing on a different value perspective. Now, obviously, in the real world, we're probably including all of these all at once. So when we look at that triangle that I showed you, quite often we find most of the time we really want to be somewhere in the middle to make sure that we're actually bringing all these different values into our plans for the future. And when we do that, making sure that we're not missing it. So that's, I think, really what's going on in New Zealand. This is one of the pictures from our national biodiversity strategy, Te Mana Te Taio. And here you can see people, nature, Indigenous values all into this one diagram. So in New Zealand, we are, if anyone has been to New Zealand, we pride ourselves in a very green, beautiful environment. So New Zealand is very much around those landscapes and seascapes and beauty. But our environment and our economy is also very much based on the economic or the market values we have for what we get from land. So New Zealand is very much based on dairying and fisheries and other things, so that those nature for society values. And unless our environment is healthy, we won't be getting the value that we want out of the things dependent on the land. And of course, New Zealand has a very vibrant Indigenous population. I think it's roughly 15% of the population specifically identifies as Maori, and far more have some Maori ancestry. So we have all of these things that we're trying to manage, our treaty relationships and other things. And how do we bring that in within New Zealand to make sure our nature positive futures and our targets are covering not just intrinsic values for nature, which our prior biodiversity strategies would have been focused mostly on endangered species and managing habitats and invasive species, but bringing in those financial values, our different markets that use land, as well as our indigenous values. So we've had a number of workshops with central government. The most recent one was actually the last couple of days. And we have a very vibrant Aotearoa Environmental Monitoring Association, which includes all of our research institutes and our central and regional government. And so we've picked 2 case studies for which to apply the Nature Futures framework so far. One is looking at coastal restoration. And like many places in the world, not all of New Zealand is doing all that well. We do have problems of things being built on the coast, lots of infrastructure, declines in salt marsh and other types of vegetation, declines in our shellfish beds. Our seagrass, for an unknown reason, has started coming back in spite of not a lot changing in the water quality. And mangrove forests for us are a strange one because they're actually increasing, which is actually a negative impact because it's showcasing how much sediment is coming in. But the question is, how do we prioritize when we have funding for coastal wetland restoration? Where do we go? What do we do? And how can we use the Nature Futures framework to better decide which places to do restoration? So I think in all cases, so this will be for any scenario process, you have the constraints that you have to begin with. So little things like mapping, where could we restore? And so we've done a lot of this. We know where the current areas are of each of the different types of habitat. We also know, based on their tidal preferences, where they could go. We know the rules about land ownership. We know the challenges with a lot of our statutes and regulations on what we can and can't do, and some of the things that we really need to sort out in terms of land ownership. But we have all of that kind of sorted, but that still doesn't tell us which place to pick. And so looking across the Nature Futures framework, we can look at, get another picture, there we go. We can look at different ways to prioritize where we go. So for example, in this case, I'm looking at nature for society, or nature's contributions to people. If we're going to manage based on carbon sequestration, we know how much carbon is sequestered by the different habitat types. Mangroves in that picture in the top middle, you can see they're very good at sequestering carbon, mostly because most of their biomass is actually underground in the root material. So they have far more biomass or carbon that's stored for the long term compared to terrestrial trees. But we also have those coastal protection type values, so we can actually plan and prioritize coastal wetland restoration around places that will give the best bang for buck for protection of cities, or other things with coastal restoration, or for getting those carbon benefits. We're hoping in the near future we will have blue carbon included in our climate mitigation targets. We're working on that as well. So we have priorities and a very different map if we're looking at what we would be prioritizing for society. We also could prioritize based on nature values, those intrinsic values. So we know where our sensitive habitats are. I've cheated and put a picture there that's very unlike New Zealand mangroves. We don't have any obligate birds or any obligate fish. We have kind of often short, stumpy, or little hobbit mangroves that might be about 1/2 meter tall in some areas, up to about 8 meters in some areas in the north. But a lot of our mangroves don't quite have the same role, but they are a valuable species in terms of what they do support, but a bit different from other areas of the world where mangroves support whole ecosystems. And then we could also prioritize for relational values. How on earth would you prioritize coastal relations or restoration for relational values? And we thought about that and went, actually, that's not that hard. So during the pandemic, we had a project called Jobs for Nature, and I can't remember how much money it was, but it was a huge amount of money that went to employ people to work on nature projects. And a lot of the decisions on where the funding went had nothing to do with those societal values, the blue carbon sequestration, or the best places to do nature conservation. They were actually set up to target places where people needed jobs and reconnecting communities. So particularly our Northland community had a very high unemployment rate. So lots of funding went up in Northland. And this resulted in a lot of communities, younger people moving back to their hometowns. I know Japan will have the same issues that New Zealand does, where our young people move to the cities and often don't come back. We also have lots of people move overseas and they don't come back until they retire. So creating that job network and the upskilling really became one of those things that coastal restoration could build, building skills, supporting jobs, bringing that sense of community through community restoration. It's not in this picture, but all of our community restoration groups throughout New Zealand do lots and lots of things, but most of it is around building community of these groups of 20 or 50 people that meet on a weekly or monthly basis doing restoration. So, and then of course, within New Zealand, reconnecting with our cultural practices. So bringing our younger Maori kids back home to reinvest in their culture, relearn from their ancestors, their grandparents on the cultural practices that they had. So you can see we get very different types of values. Again, with coastal wetland restoration, they are all nature positive, but they're all quite different and would result in quite different maps of where you would prioritize or put funding into restoration. And then I've just got kind of a couple slides on one more example. And I actually got to see Wakami in the flesh a couple of days ago. That was quite exciting for me. This slide is from a master's thesis that was submitted on March 14th, so just about 10 days ago. So, but we actually did a case study on invasive macroalgae in New Zealand, so our invasive kelps, and we do have Undaria, and it's been quite controversial in New Zealand because it's an invasive kelp. It does not belong in New Zealand, but it's there now, and all efforts to eradicate it for the last 30 or more years have been unsuccessful. So what do we do when we have an invasive species? Do we continue to spend a lot of money trying to eradicate it? Or do we recognize that it does have other values for society that we can use? So a lot of this, we have nature for nature values. It is habitat forming. So it's potentially much more temperature tolerant than a lot of our native kelps that are showing huge decreases with the heat wave activities that we had. So potentially it's a replacement nature kelp forest that might persist with climate change a bit better in New Zealand. Nature for society, it's harvested for food, for fertilizer. And we have a whole suite of jobs based on control and maintenance. So lots of people are employed in that eradication response. We also have nature as culture. So we've created these invasive communities around not invasive communities, these stakeholder communities created around eradicating, but also these communities based on harvesting. So one of our iwi, actually one of our local tribes now has a permit to harvest Undaria. So how do they best do that? Where are the places that are better? And you'll notice in this lovely diagram that we have, there are a lot of reds. That basically meant it was a negative impact detected by the various stakeholders that we interviewed, whereas green showed the positive. But that basically shows, like in anything we do, we need to manage around that diversity of values. So where are places where we have high value nature values, whether it's sensitive habitats, and there would be somewhere where we put more effort into managing Undaria and eradicating Undaria, where other places where it might be serving as habitat or as a food or harvesting resource, then we'd be managing for that. So it just really shows the value of considering not a one size fit all, but recognizing that diversity of values across the whole landscape. I think I have about 2 minutes left. So we aren't just working on dairy. This is through our Ministry for Primary Industries. Then our other big case study is looking at biosecurity. And in New Zealand, pest control is a big deal. So we have our big predator-free New Zealand 2050. Imagine a whole country being predator-free. By predators, we're meaning stoats and rats. So things that, and possums as well. So removing predators that aren't native to New Zealand. New Zealand had no native mammals outside of bats. But here again, we need to look at where do we prioritize the funding that we have? Do we go to indigenous lands first? Do we go to urban areas? Do we go to rural areas? Where are the places to manage? And we can use the Nature Futures Framework to inform our predator-free program. Similarly, New Zealand has a lot of economic values from other invasive species like trout. Most of our rivers and lakes are managed for trout, which are obviously not native. We have lots of forestry areas where we have high tourism and recreational value based on deer hunting, again, not native, and all sorts of things like Himalayan tar. Who knew that was in New Zealand? Wallabies, lots of things. So recognizing with the Nature Futures Framework that we can help look at those conflicts between societal and environmental objectives from everything from introduced species like these different things we hunt, but also garden plants and what management we have for garden plants and the huge disconnects between what's coming in to the country and sold in gardens and what are the pest species that are managed. Nearly done. So that's nearly me, but basically we know nature and biodiversity and ecosystem services are declining, and nature underpins our way of life and that whole diversity of values we have for nature. And so here I've hopefully shown you a bit of how we're using the Nature Futures Framework to inform new nature positive scenarios that bring together that diversity of values we have. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Caroline. I think this is great introduction, also great case studies, also including kelps, wakame case. キャロライン先生、どうもありがとうございました。まさに、今回ですね、我々のプロジェクトでも、Nature Futures Framework という枠組みを使ってシナリオ作りをして、そして、様々な生態系サービスの評価を行っています。これを南三陸、大阪、佐渡、そして日本全体で行っています。この、NFF という、Nature Futures Framework という枠組みについても非常にわかりやすく説明いただきましたし、さらにそれをいかに実際に適用して国の計画に生かしているのか、そして具体的なワカメの事例などもご紹介いただきました。ワカメについて実は南三陸でも見る機会がありまして、養殖を。でそこで伺ったのは、ニュージーランドではそれを、取り除くことで、それに対して報奨金のようなものも出るし、一方でそれを加工して売れば、それによってお金を得るということで、二重でお金を実は稼げるというなんか変な構造に実はなっているということも教えていただきました。また、今回はですね、質疑応答の時間というのを最後に準備しております。で、オンラインの方々はぜひあらかじめチャットボックスですかね、Q&A のボタンがあるんですか？どちらですか？ Q&A の、ボタンの方から、ぜひ日本語と英語どちらでも構いませんので、質問を入れていただければと思います。で、対面で参加している方は、最後のセッションで、これも日本語ないし英語で質問をいただければ、日本語で質問いただいた部分は、こちらの我々の研究者の方のスタッフが、英語にして、スピーカーに伝えますので、チャットじゃなくて Q&A で、オンラインで Q&A のボタンで入れる方も、我々のスタッフがモニターしてますので、事前に英語ないし日本語で入れていただければ、それで対応する形で最終的に、最終的に全ての質問に答えられるかどうかっていうのはちょっと、保証はできないんですけれども、時間の限りで、質問に対応させていただくということで、I'm explaining about Q&A sessionですabout translation process ね。ということで、次のスピーカーですね、ポール・リドリー先生で、フランスから来ていただいております。で、彼もずっとイプベスのアセスメントをリードして、この シナリオですとかモデリングの研究をずっとリードしてきた、まさに世界的にも、の第一人者ということになりますので、ぜひ講演を楽しみにいただければと思います。Floor is yours.
So first of all, thank you to the S-21 organizers, especially for our field trip. That was really incredibly interesting to go and visit this site and learn about all the things that are going on in the S-21 project. So thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Carolyn. I'm going to be talking about a subject that's a little more technical and actually frequently makes both scientists and decision makers a little bit more uncomfortable. And that's the question of uncertainty. So I'm going to talk about it in a very general sense, give some examples that are not related to nature positive futures, and then talk about it specifically how that's related to nature positive futures. So just going back to the IPBES assessment on scenarios and models, and thank you so much for introducing that, Carolyn. There are number of high-level messages. The high-level message that I want you to focus on. So there were only 3 very high-level messages. And the second one is about uncertainty. And it says that we have lots of different methods, but they have to be used with lots of caution because we need to take into account uncertainties and unpredictability associated with model-based projections. So why did we bring that message all the way up into one of the 3 main messages that came out of this? And that is that all models and scenarios have strengths and weaknesses, and we have to acknowledge in that. And when especially we're using models and scenarios for decision-making or in assessments, we need to communicate that very clearly. And the second key finding about uncertainty is that we don't do that very well, typically. So uncertainty associated with models and assessments is often poorly evaluated in published studies. And so one of the pieces of guidance that we gave to the scientific community is that we should do a much better job of this in the future. And one of the reasons that that's essential is that when we don't discuss uncertainty clearly, we undermine the confidence that we can have in decision makers when we're talking about the use of models for decision making or in assessments. So it's really key that we characterize uncertainty as part of a key component of their credibility. And so I want to go through some thinking about actually how you go about looking uncertainty, what are the different sources of uncertainty when you're developing models, explain why it's so important, provide some examples of how actually that's already been done in terms of dealing with nature positive scenarios, and then how you actually try and account for that in decision making. And so why are sources of uncertainty, what are the sources of uncertainty, how can they be evaluated, and why it's so important? So I'll start with the why it's so important. Every day, or regardless of what you do, you're confronted with uncertainty. So if you're taking the train, you have to think about to go catch an airplane, which I'm going to do tomorrow morning. You have to think about what the odds are that your train will be late. It's in Japan, odds are low, so my uncertainty is low. As I'm doing in France, my uncertainty is high. It could be half an hour late, so I better take that into account. The problem is that when you start talking about scenarios and models for biodiversity, people have a hard time understanding what's behind these. And so the idea of taking into this complexity about uncertainty and decision-making all of a sudden becomes a scary kind of thing to do. And so in many cases, the reaction from decision makers, businesses, governments, and things like that is that just tell us what the future is going to look like, and we don't want you to talk too much about uncertainty. And I'll just give a really good example. France has just developed its climate change adaptation program, national adaptation program. They're asking every actor in businesses and government to come up with a plan for 4 degrees warming in France. They have said explicitly they don't want people to think too much about uncertainty. And as a scientific community, we're saying that's really, really dangerous, because if you're planning what the future is going to be, it's very likely that it won't be that. And so if you're doing that, that can cause some real problems. And so I want to use an example. I want to first of all look at the different kinds of uncertainty, and then I'll use some examples about why not dealing with uncertainty can cause so many problems. So in this graphic, you have number of areas where you can have uncertainty. So the sort of clear purple areas are related to scenarios. That means the qualitative storylines. These are the kinds of things that the storylines are the sort of qualitative ways that we explain what we think that the future might look like, whether that's a future that we want, whether it's a future that's nature positive, or whether that's a future that's not good. There's lots of uncertainties with that. And one of the things that the S-21 project is doing that's incredibly good, and one of the things that the Nature Future Framework tried to lay out, is that we need to be able to deal with what nature positive futures look like with different perspectives. What is nature positive? There's so much linguistic uncertainty about that. You can think of it as a diversity of values and a diversity of ways of looking what the positive nature future looks like, but you can also think of what the kinds of uncertainty that also brings when you're thinking about trying to use these in decision making. The blue areas are the areas where you actually get uncertainty related to your mathematical models, where you're going to translate those qualitative scenarios into something much more quantitative. So how population is going to grow, how land use change is going to impact biodiversity, how much climate change is going to impact ecosystem services, and we need to take into account uncertainty there. And then we also have decision making and how you're going to, the different kinds of tools that you're going to be using to deal with uncertainty. My colleagues are going to be mostly talking about the little purple circles. And so actually, I'm not going to be talking too much about the storyline uncertainty, although I will talk about that a little bit. Mostly, I'm going to be talking about the quantification, the uncertainties related to quantification. So how can we evaluate uncertainty, especially when we're doing quantification of scenarios or models? We can do lots of benchmarking, and that's just making sure that your scenarios correspond to something you see in reality. And that can be lots of different things. And one of the great things about the S-21 project is that you have so much information. You're in an incredibly information-rich situation that you can do lots of fact-checking, benchmarking to make sure that your quantification of your scenarios is realistic. You can also do what we call sensitivity or uncertainty analysis, and that's making sure that when you vary the different parameters or quantifications of things in your models and scenarios, that you have an understanding of what the uncertainty in that produces. And I'll be talking a little bit, or actually quite a bit, about using model intercomparison. So that's using different models to compare and see if those different models produce different things, and therefore we can learn a lot from that. So my first example is an old example, but I still think it's a valuable example. And this is work that we did working with the forestry community in France about what climate change impacts might look like on major forest species. So that's the list of the major forest species that we're looking here are on the right side of this graph. And this is a typical model intercomparison. So we're using very common data that goes into several different models. So we're using common climate projections on the left-hand side. We're using common maps of the current distributions of these major tree species. We're using common maps of soil properties. And then we're using a wide range of models. This is the model intercomparison. We're using a wide range of models. Up on top, these niche-based models, these are statistical models that don't have any explanation of mechanisms in them. And on the bottom of this are mechanistic models that model things like photosynthesis, evapotranspiration, how much carbon is stored in ecosystems and things like that. And then comparing them to see how we can, what we can learn about uncertainty. So I'm going to start with the worst case situation. So here you have, this is a map of France, where it's red is where this species, the beech, which is a major forest species in France, occurs. Where it's red, it's where the model is predicting that the tree species already is, but where climate by 2055 will be unsuitable. So maybe you should think about not having that tree species where it's red. Where it's green, it means the tree species is predicted to be there and will continue to be there even in 2055, or the climate will be favorable. And where it's light blue and you don't see a lot of that is actually where the climate becomes favorable for this tree species. But what you can see is that the three on the top are very red. So they're basically predicting everywhere in low altitude that climate will be unsuitable. Those are all statistical models. On the bottom, you have the mechanistic models that are explaining the mechanism behind it. They're all predicting that that loss of climate area will be relatively small. What do you do in the face of this uncertainty? Foresters, up until we did this research, were using that scenario to make decisions. And the decision was, we're going to remove beech from our forests. We're not going to plant beech anymore because this mathematical model is telling us that it's going to die back even by mid-century. And that's a really bad idea because scientifically, we don't know if that's the response. And in fact, it's not dying back as much as many other tree species are doing. So what do you do in the face of this diversity of outcomes? What do you do in the face of that uncertainty? And the interesting thing is to have this discussion with those people actually managing forests and think about what this actually means. The one I think the response that is most favorable as viewed from the scientific standpoint is to diversify your management practices. And in fact, what you're trying to do is create resilience in the face of climate change instead of saying, well, beech is going to disappear, so I'm just going to remove it from all my forests and I'm going to plant species that are better adapted to 4 degrees warming. If you do that, you're planning for a future that may not occur. And it could be a very bad decision. So this is much better. So there's a flip side of that. That's the positive side. These are the same models modeling the position, the Scots pine. I guess it's not good in the sense that they're all predicting that Scots pine will have a hard time at low altitudes in France. So first of all, you've got multi-model. And then I'm going to zoom through some slides very quickly. My apologies for that. That's exactly what we're seeing when you in observations. Scots pine is dying in southern parts of Europe. That's exactly what we see when we do experiments and we do reciprocal transplants of trees across Europe. Trees if you take them from northern Europe and you transplant them towards the south, they die and they don't grow well. So everything there leads to the same conclusion and gives you high confidence that, in fact, the forestry community, which was actively planting Scots pine because it grows fast and it can be easily, has high economic value, that maybe it wasn't a good idea to be planting this, especially since many of times they were planting outside of its native range. So that's sort of the basis. So how do we do this when we're talking about nature positive scenarios? So what I want to talk about, and I think Gary's going to be coming back to this, is thinking about nature positive scenarios and what we call bending the curve. So bending the curve is, so the way to read this graphic is the black line that's just going straight down is the business as usual scenario. And that's pretty typical for what we see at global scales out into the future. The bending the curve is asking the question, can we, at least for some measure of biodiversity, not just slow this down, but actually have positive effects on biodiversity in the future? And this comes from the Global Biodiversity Outlook 5 from the Convention on Biological Diversity. And this was actually before we actually had any good models to show this. This is sort of a schematic representation of what we thought bending the curve would look like and what would underlie that. And underlying idea was that conservation alone was not enough, and that you needed to have active climate mitigation, needed sustainable production, and needed a reduced consumption in order to bend the curve. Why was this message important for decision makers? It's because the Convention on Biological Diversity, in part, wanted to convince governments and other decision makers that overly focusing on conservation measures alone was not going to fix the biodiversity problem. And so the question is then, when we start looking at that quantitatively, is that what it looks like? And this is when you start looking at nature positive futures. And I want to talk about just one effort major effort that was done to try and look at this and think about how uncertainty plays a role in this. So this is the Bending the Curve initiative that was exploring nature positive futures. And they were asking the question, can we develop plausible scenarios for the future that are nature positive? And what would it take actually to get to nature positive? And they said, okay, let's take into account some realistic ideas about conservation. So for example, let's say that at the global scale, we actually do manage to conserve, put in protected areas, 30% of terrestrial ecosystems and 30% of marine ecosystems, for example. What happens if we actually try and meet the targets for restoring ecosystems at national and global scales? And what happens if we do just that? Then let's look at how changing supply side, and especially related to food, because that's one of the primary drivers of biodiversity loss at global and national scales. So what happens if we do agriculture? In particular, this is land-based, this is a terrestrial exercise. So this was looking primarily at agriculture. And then what happens if we look at supply side, demand side? So especially reducing waste, food waste, and looking at diet shifts, especially away from red meat. So if we add all these things together, can we get to a nature positive future? And so I'm not going to talk about all the details in this slide, just kind of focus on the top line up there, and there's just lots of information about those kinds of different things. So there were 7 different scenarios. So you're exploring a range of different scenarios. So you're thinking about the uncertainty related with different scenarios, using 4 different land use models. So you're thinking about how those storylines get transformed into land use change. And then you're looking at how land use change gets converted into impacts on biodiversity. And there were 7 biodiversity models that operated at global scales. And so I'm going to summarize all of that in one slide, which actually doesn't do justice to all the analysis of uncertainty that was done, but I think the main messages are here. So this is one measure of biodiversity change. It's biodiversity intactness. So this is how natural are ecosystems. It's a measure of how natural ecosystems are. The black line on this going down is the business as usual scenario. And the yellow line that's going up is the, we're actually integrating supply side, demand side, and also conservation. And what that showed is that we can bend the curve, but there's a lot of uncertainty around that. And much of that uncertainty actually comes from the land use models where you're taking the storyline. So this is exactly the same storyline, that we're going to use less land. We're going to try and conserve land for species. We're going to have protected areas out there. It's just the uncertainty that's related to the model that was used and the way it was quantified from the storyline. And those are those envelopes that you see around those, and the dots and points that you see there. That's just the uncertainty that it comes from those. And then if you compare the 2 graphs, the one that's labeled in green GloBio and the other one that's labeled predicts, that's the difference in the mathematical models that are translating land use into biodiversity impacts. What's the good news? The good news is that regardless of the land use model you're using, regardless of the mathematical model that you're using to predict impacts on biodiversity, the yellow line is always well above the business as usual. And in most cases, it actually is bending the curve. So this is demonstrating that it is plausible to bend the curve. And it's not just one model that's saying that. It means that we can say that with a fairly high degree of certainty. And that's really important when you start talking to decision makers and start doing assessments. And that means that we can draw graphs like this that are very stylistic representations of this. And essentially what this is showing is that this curve that's going all the way down at the bottom, that's business as usual. And we can draw that stylistically because we know that that's what it looks like. The curve on the top is one where we do both conservation, supply side, and demand interventions. And the one in the middle is where we do conservation only. And we can draw that and we can say that with confidence because we've looked at the uncertainty that's associated with it. So I'm not going to talk about this slide, just say that IPBES has actually already tried to do this in the best sim projections that were used for the global assessment. There's another series of best sim that are being prepared for the next global assessment. They've done a reasonably good job at looking at uncertainty as well. And another way to look at this is also through evaluation of many different publications. And one of the biggest problems we are faced when we do that is the comparison between different kinds of publications. And especially as the scenarios and modeling assessment said, many of those publications do a fairly poor job of evaluating uncertainty. And so what has been done is to create a perspective, which is to use what we call archetypes of scenarios to try and group similar kinds of scenarios together and then evaluate uncertainty based on that. So you've got all this. How are you going to take this into account when you start making decisions? One of the things that can be done is to just have a qualitative discussion of this with the decision makers. What's really important, and I think what the IPBES model and scenarios assessment clearly laid out, is that we've got lots of tools for actually trying to manage this uncertainty, and they're underused in decision making. And I'm not going to go into the details. There's an entire chapter in the IPBES scenarios and modeling assessment about the different kinds of decision-making tools that we have available and the ways that they deal with uncertainty. And the important thing about these is that they can deal with both the sort of quantitative uncertainty that I've been talking about, but they can also try and deal with all those things that we can't quantify very well. So you don't have to be able to quantify uncertainty for everything to be using many of these decision support tools. And both in that IPBES assessment, but also in this paper that we published a couple of years ago, the decision support tool that you want to be using, it depends on how much information you have about that system. That's this axis on the bottom here. And your focus on whether you want to be looking at uncertainty or risk, where you have known probabilities, and what kinds of values that you're looking at. And that's directly related to the kinds of things that you're discussing in S-21. Is everybody kind of in agreement about what your values are, or do you have very different values with very different stakeholders who don't necessarily share opinions on things? So we have these tools. I'm not going to go into the details of the tools. I think it's really important for both the scientists and decision makers to be thinking about the potential of using these tools when using scenarios and models for decision making. And I'm going to end, perhaps, I think, with maybe the most important diagram that we made. May not be the easiest to interpret, but the message from this IPBES assessment, model scenarios and modeling assessment, is really clear. If you want to be using models and scenarios in decision making, it's just incredibly important to have this continuous dialogue between scientists and decision makers. don't bring them on board at the end of the process. They have to be involved at the beginning of the process. And we see clear evidence in S-21 that there's a lot of attention being paid to making sure that stakeholders, decision makers are being brought on board fairly early on the process, that remains a tight dialogue throughout the process, and that there's follow-up after that, so that there can be confidence in what's going into the models and scenarios. The decision makers understand what's behind it. And then after they've been developed and delivered, they know how to mobilize it and use it, and can come back to that scientific community and think about actually how to mobilize that information. And unfortunately, that's something that all too often we don't do well as a scientific community. Project's over, 5 years funding, project finished, and then our decision makers, the business community, governments no longer have that interaction with us. That may be the most important message. Uncertainty is really important. The most important thing is to have that discussion going on throughout the entire process. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Paul. It was quite inspiring presentation about the uncertainty. Actually, when I heard the title of your presentation, I was a bit worried about, is this really, but it's really interesting presentation. I really appreciate your presentation, and especially the three uncertainty, the source of the uncertainties, and uncertainty in quantification, and also the last point is uncertainty in decision making. ということで、彼からのタイトルを聞いたときはですね、これで、一般の方がどこまで理解していただけるのかという、実は僕不安があったんですけれども、非常にクリアな、プレゼンテーションで、非常に、わかりやすかったですし、特にポリシーメーカーにとっても重要な資産に富む、研究者にとってもそうですけれども、行政、意思決定、政策決定者にとっても非常に有効な、知見が多く含まれていたというふうに思いました。で、特に、IPBES の Nexus Assessment の、図も含めていただいて、So, thank you very much for including the Nexus Assessment. ということで、僕自身もその Nexus Assessment というのに、3年ほど関わって、ようやく、終わったんですけれども、今まさに、ポールが言ったように、ディシジョンサポートツールですね。これ、Nexus のアセスメントの中でも、一つの章が、ディシジョン、意思決定支援のツールについて、調べた章があります。So the Nexus assessment also include one section which focuses on the decision support tools, and we are now working on the publication. ということで、そういったこともありますので、また最新情報をいろんな形で共有できればというふうに思っていますし、最後の、ポールのメッセージである、早い段階で研究者と、現地のステークホルダーとの関係を、対話ですね。これが非常に重要で、まさに、昨日まで言っていた南三陸でも、命めぐる学会というものを通じてですね、まさに去年、早い段階でシナリオ作りのワークショップを行いました。で、今年もまた11月に、続きのワークショップを行って、我々が作ったシナリオだったりとか、それに基づいた予測結果を共有をして、そしてまたそこにフィードバックをいただくということを予定しております。So actually in Myanmar, we organized the first scenario workshop last December, and we are planning to have that second one in the coming November this year to share what we developed as a storyline, and also some of the preliminary result of the scenario analysis will be shared, and we will get feedback from local stakeholders. では、後半進めたいと思います。後半、2人、スピーカーがおります。まず最初に、ガリー・ピーターソン先生で、ストックホルム・リジェンセンター、ストックホルム大の中にある、すごく著名な研究センターで、レジリエンスに関する研究だけでなくてですね、生態系サービス、生物多様性に関する研究も長く務められております。で、IPBESでは、シナリオタスクフォースのメンバーでもありました。では、ガリー先生よろしくお願いします。So, you can speak in Japanese.
So, yeah, 今、私の、日本語はすごい悪い。washaretta. So, and also just, so now I'm going to do it in English. So I'm actually giving a totally different talk. So I think actually the talk I didn't give, which is in the handout, is, interestingly relates to Paul's, but, we saw that there are many people from business and government here, and we didn't really have a talk talking about business, which is something I work on. So we changed. So I'm going to talk about especially about finance and how finance relates to nature positive future. So my apologies to the translators, but hopefully this will be interesting. And I think it follows on nicely from Paul's and Carolyn's. Yep. I'm trying to press. Oh, there we go. Sorry, Gomez. Okay. So as Paul was saying, nature is declining rapidly, and he showed, and global scientific assessments clearly state that we need to have transformative change. So not just changing one thing, but we need to change multiple things to be able to revive biodiversity. And the thing is, a challenge, I think if anyone has looked at the news today, or been alive for the last few years, you know that we're living in a time when the world is not calm and rational. There's an unpredictable president in the White House who seems to be more interested in attacking his allies than the adversaries. And this is geopolitical instability. And that our nature loss has already created a world in which the picture over there showing is that most of the mammals living on the planet are animals that we look after and eat. So most of the biomass of mammals is humans and our pets and farm animals. And wild animals are only 4% of this. So we've already radically changed the world that exists. And this is causing lots of consequences of changing land use through deforestation, having this a picture of people sheltering under a bridge during a drought in India. We have the evolution of new varieties of malaria, you know, as well as COVID, flooding, blocks of transport, and down at the bottom, new types of urban fires where LA was burning a couple months ago. And so this presents a challenge for making this transition because there's many events that are distracting people and people have to cope with. And one of the key sectors that often isn't talked about with nature is what I'll say finance. I'm going to mostly talk about finance and business. And when I say finance, I basically mean money as distinct from economics. And many big companies in all sorts of different sectors control what goes on in the world through their decisions. Where deforestation happens, where money flows to. And we need to understand how this system works. And my colleagues have termed these kind of actors, keystone actors, because they shape the flows of energy, materials, and even life around the world. And we need to understand and engage them. And sometimes these are government entities like the Norwegian or the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund, but often these are private companies that are owned sometimes by the people in this room through our pensions. So you can think of this picture on the right, that finance connects to nature in two ways. One is that it benefits from all the services, the resources that people get from nature, but it's also exposed to these risks and shocks. However, finance and largely business has not been really seeing or accounting for all these benefits that it gets from nature, or able to accurately assess these shocks and risks that it's facing and are rapidly changing. And when I'm talking about finance, because these top arrows, I'm thinking about not just private equity investors, but also things like development banks that try and catalyze investment for the public good, also about regulators and central banks that try and keep the economy stable. and things like markets, which set the rules by which people can exchange. And all of these determine and influence how companies engage with the planet. So the World Bank has talked about two things that need to happen in the world of money to get to a nature positive future, which other people have different words, but these are greening finance and financing green. And what they mean by this is greening finance is making finances, stopping finance from funding the destruction of the planet. And financing green is funding things that are actually nature positive. And I'm sure as everyone in the room and online is aware, the amount of money that's going to funding nature destruction is massively bigger than financing green. So this is a big transformation that we need to have. But good things don't happen without money, and bad things happen because they have money. So one of the ways of thinking about this when people think about transforming to a nature positive is using the idea of three horizons. And three horizons is thinking first about where we are today, and the third horizon is where we want to be, and the second horizon is how we have the conflict or transition between these. And so you can think about this in terms of this greening finance or financing green, of how do you get this small amount of nature positive investments to grow, and how do you wind down the funding of nature destruction in a way that works? Because things that are destroying nature are providing people with jobs, providing children with healthcare, helping people feel safe and secure. So if this is going to happen, it needs to happen in a way that people will accept. So I'm going to talk about a couple of examples of thinking about how things can grow or shrink. So I think Laura will talk a little bit more. Carolyn already mentioned the idea of seeds. So if you want to learn more about them, you can look at my abandoned talk. But the idea of seeds is a sort of a metaphor for what are initiatives that people are doing that could help achieve a sustainable future. And you can look around the world and you can find many examples of seeds where people are trying to connect finance to nature in a positive way. And so what I mean by a seed is something that exists in the world that is a different way of doing things that people think can contribute to a sustainable future, and that moves money towards creating this different system. So up here are just three examples of different types of seeds. One is the Foundation for Ecological Security in India, which is a pretty big NGO that works with poor people to restore marginal land to improve their livelihoods. But importantly, and why it's ecological security, it also works with them to set up institutions to manage this land and protect it from being grabbed by wealthy, rich people living nearby once they've restored it. So it's about changing the way that resources flow in various poor communities living on degraded land. A more financial markets one is the Mesoamerican Reef Fund's Reef Rescue Initiative, which is setting up a fund that's creating a pool of money that's mobilized to flow to places to help them recover after coral bleaching events. So it's a fund that's set up to help reefs that have been exposed to high temperatures of water and damage to try and recover after they've been damaged. So it's something that's retroactive, but giving to resources to respond to ecological disaster. Another example from France is La Nef, which is a cooperative bank that tries to, as a nonprofit, and it tries to fund nature and socially positive investments, right? So a different type of structure. So my colleagues and I analyzed we collected a wide variety of these things from around the world and analyzed them to also look to see, well, what types of nature positive futures are they imagining? And so this is using the framework that Carolyn and Paul have talked about. So we could see that there's actually quite a mix of values that these seeds are focusing on. Values associated with nature for society dominate. There's more of them than anyone else, but there are ones that look at all of them, look at multiple things together, and that do look at preserving cultural landscapes and cultural practices, as well as protecting nature. So this is saying that there's actually quite a diversity of ways that people think about nature in this kind of financial sector, but it's about how to do this better and how to grow these types of initiatives. So these are sort of seeds of hope. And how we kind of imagine these types of transitions is that you get big change when these when these seeds that are isolated manage to kind of connect together and mutually reinforce one another. And if these can start to grow, they can become a new tentative type of system. But this can always fail and fall apart as it's been pushed out by something else, or it can be gobbled up by the status quo. But sometimes in the right moment, these manage to grow and become a new type of system. So I think this kind of seeds analysis, we cannot tell what seeds will succeed, but we can tell which ones are almost very unlikely to succeed. But whether things grow or not depends upon what kind of context they're growing in. And this is partly about what events happen at the larger scale and whether they can get resources and whether they are able to survive where they exist. So this is something where the big actors can help them, but it's always going to be a bit about where they are. And we've tried to study how these seeds grow and thinking about there are a variety of different strategies, thinking about of them kind of amplifying what they're doing themselves, amplifying or growing out, and then going up to a different level. And this is a framework that people studying transformation have worked on a lot. And when we try and assess, this is a different set of seeds, but food seeds from Stockholm, we can see that these seeds take different, use different mixes of these strategies where some are more common than other. But these are things that they actually need to do to grow. And so you can analyze this type of stuff. So one side is growing this green, the other one is unraveling the red. So one way that I like to think about this is you can think about that is the resilience of bad ways of doing things. So I work at the Stockholm Resilience Center, so we often think about resilience. Many people think resilience is a good thing, and sometimes it is. It's good if you're, resilient and you don't get sick. But if we have really pathological systems that are destroying the world, their resilience is a really bad thing. It's pathological resilience. And so we tried to think about, well, what are some general patterns of pathological resilience that you need to unravel? And using this type of thing, you can think there's people who impact nature, who have social impacts that change human impacts, and there's some type of governance. So we tried to look across all of these things and seeing some kind of archetypes of pathologies. And I'll just kind of go through these briefly. But the idea is that these are things that block change. So the first one, a long fuse Big Bang, means that there's slow dynamics. So you don't need to do anything now, but as you wait around, the problem gets worse and worse until you get a big explosion. So this is a kind of type of thing people would typically talk about with climate change or any kind of accumulation of pollution problem. Another one, the opposite of this, is kind of rapid evolution, where things occur very quickly and environmental problems emerge very quickly, say with maybe illegal harvesting or something. And by the time that society is able to respond, it's too late. So this could be with fishers roaming around in the world. They can harvest up a whole bunch of fish around Antarctica, and they move on before the governments who are trying to regulate this have even realized it's a problem and the fish are gone. Next one is unforeseen processes. There's lots of stuff that we actually don't understand. An iconic example of this is the ozone hole, which people didn't expect that to be occurring. And then only by chance did we actually discover it. Another kind of related thing is things that where there is an unrecognized spatial connection. So this can be something that we very, very well understand scientifically, but something like, say, the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico in the United States is that nutrients from the Midwest flow down the Mississippi and kill the fishery in the Gulf of Mexico. This is that scientists understand this, but there's no mechanism to resolve this between the states that are fishing around the Gulf and the ones that are benefiting from farming. And two more are Commons dilemma, which is probably all people are aware of, where you have a bunch of social actors where it's difficult for them to agree upon something that would benefit them all to do. And so they keep doing the bad thing. And then institutional rigidity, that there's a set of structures that are people benefit from that they don't want to change, even though society would benefit from changing them. And you can kind of think and analyze global environmental problems, which I'm not showing here, with these type of pathologies, but these are types of things that are structuring the current financial system to not allow it to change. And there's a wide variety of structures that you can do to address these. And this is, I think, that mostly like Paul was saying, one of these by itself doesn't work, but you can think about doing them together. You can unravel these things. And this is, I think, where we need more cross-disciplinary collaboration between things like accountants and political scientists and ecologists to think about ways in which you can change the way that corporations report their impact or benefit to society that are taking into account for these connections. But just some of these of like enhancing governance, strengthening institutional linkages, creating new rules, incentives, reducing social inequality, building social capital and trust, reducing pressure on the environment, using less, for example, having societal innovation, monitoring social ecological change, and enhancing scientific understanding. And I think you probably recognize your own work that are working on some part of this. But the point is that if you're just influencing one of these connections, you're very unlikely to change these pathological dynamics. And we need to do them all at once. So to bring this kind of together, can kind of think about, we have lots of these pathological dynamics up here that are keeping us doing nature destruction. And we have small seeds of positive practices that we want to think about how we can amplify and how we can have some kind of hospice care or looking after the sick and elderly to bring these down and avoid a big backlash. Now I'm going to be a bit more specific. So you can think about this in the financial system as a system, that there's a wide variety of actors in the financial system. And if you talk to someone who's working in private equity and a hedge fund, they'll explain the financial system quite different to you than someone who's working in a central bank or a ratings agency, because they interact with certain parts of it and not so much with other ones, which is sort of shown over here. And you can think about what these different actors do in terms of how do they influence movement towards sustainability. So some of them can filter out things like whether you're listed on a market or not determines whether you can be traded. There's rules for whether you can be on a market. Other ones promote different types of activities by giving them money. And other ones can influence them. If you're a private equity investor and you own shares in a company, you can, if you earn a little, you can vote at shareholders meeting. And if you own a lot, you can elect board members who change the policies of those companies. So lots of these analyses are thinking about these things is done from these perspective of different actors, whether it's rating agencies or proxy providers or stock exchange or venture capitalists or private equity or lenders or insurance companies or development banks. But you can kind of think about how these could possibly interact to reinforce one another rather than block one another, which is currently the case. So this is, for example, if private equity is looking for investments, they need tools by which they can use to evaluate whether these investments are indeed actually nature positive. If you're a creator of ratings, you need people who want to buy the ratings that you want to provide. And so if there's no incentive to do that, you're not going to produce them. So just to kind of now be more general, so there's some big barrier, like research barriers, which sort of my colleagues work on, to how we can make this happen, which is try and deal with some of these gaps in these feedbacks. Is that one of them is that we don't really have, or financial actors do not have tools and strategies that incorporate the complexity and multiple dimensions of biodiversity into economic decision-making. So this is the first two talks about the different nature values and uncertainty. So to tell a bank that biodiversity is really complex doesn't really help them. And neither does helping them, giving them some index of the biodiversity score in some pixel of a global map tell them about their investments because they're not investing in a pixel on the map. So this is something that the environmental science community has made lots of tools that are designed for, say, producing protected areas or helping people manage their agricultural land or forests, but not for helping investors think about what is a good investment. So there's actually a big demand for nature positive investments, but people don't have any kind of standards for thinking about what these actually are and how to design them. So there's things even right now of say sustainability bonds, which haven't grown as a market because people can't agree upon how to measure sustainability to make the conditions by which the bond would pay off, right? In a way, people can propose them, but they haven't got ways that align with people want to invest in. A third one, which hadn't really talked about, but Paul kind of touched on, is that biodiversity data is really uneven around the world, and it's often not in a form that's useful for financial actors or making financial decisions. So this is like the data that you need to use in your tools. And then a lot of the work of, say, IPBES has addressed policymakers and national governments because they're the conveners for national governments, but these really powerful financial actors have not really been addressed up until right now. There's a IPBES report on business and biodiversity that's the first one to really actually address these issues of money and finance. So this is coming, but it's not really been there yet. So I've worked with these guys in this task force of models and scenarios. I've worked a lot on ecosystem services. So why am I working on finance? And I think this is something that there's a real opportunity to do this. There's big progress in monitoring nature. There's new technologies from eDNA to sound to improve remote sensing and computational things that people are now fusing together to get better pictures. They're not there yet, but it's very rapidly changing. There's also a big improvement in the types of models and type of model comparison that Paul was talking about. 20 years ago, most ecological or biological models were at a tiny scale and couldn't deal with answering questions of what's the difference of making this action, which you need to attribute to if you're making some investment. Did your investment make a difference? And there's all these policy frameworks from the Global Biodiversity Framework to EU Green Deal to China's ecological civilization and their use of GEP and corporate developments, corporate sustainability standards that some of which have been pushed back or abandoned in the US. I think still kind of going forward in Japan, and EU's a bit in limbo, but also the TNFD, a private one, is rapidly growing. And then finally, I've worked with economists for about 30 years. And I've worked with people at development banks for a long time, but I'd never met anyone from the IMF who was interested in nature. But I was invited to go to the IMF a couple of years ago and talk to them about this because their stakeholders, which are nations, are demanding it because they're worried about nature-based risks. Central banks are worried about the risks to inflation and employment of nature-based shocks because they've seen this from COVID, worried about banking crises from natural disasters, and companies are worried about how to navigate this terrain. And just one last point of this, like we teach a CEO course on resilience and sustainability for Swedish CEOs. And we've had over half the GDP of Sweden in that course. Most of the big companies like Volvo Trucks and Skanska have been that because they're worried about how they can navigate through this. And they see that they have to kind of develop plans to deal with these policy changes and the changes in the world. And so while there is a backlash, I think this is something that there's really a positive potential to work with business and finance to make a more climate positive future. And if we don't address these monetary flows, we're going to maintain these pathodynamics, which are keeping us on this very bad trajectory. So just to conclude, I think like understanding these seeds or things that we want to grow, which I think there's a lot of that in the S-21 project, understanding the barriers and the system dynamics can help us develop, locally based and specific strategies on how to destabilize this nature negative present, how to help navigate this transition in a fair and just way, and to try and stabilize these dynamics that are producing a nature positive future. So you can find out more on our website, Finance Biodiversity. You can find out more about seeds on the Good Answers Net. And then I didn't mention it, but we have a big database of scenarios at the local level. There's social ecological at biospherefutures.net. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Gary, for very wonderful presentation covering, especially focusing on the financial transformation, including the SEAS project and also the system dynamics, pathological dynamics. Those are quite interesting. So thank you very much. So we would like to invite the final presenter today, Lola from South Africa. Yep, so floor is yours. She's been also actively working for the IPBES scenario and model task force. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Wonderful to be here. And it's always a hard act to follow the previous speakers, but I think they've really set the stage well for hopefully what will be a nice rounding of the presentations, keynotes from the group, because I'm going to go back to the Nature Futures framework. Carolyn gave a very sort of embedded discussion on sort of what's been happening from the Aotearoa New Zealand perspective, and I'm going to just give some examples of why this has been a really important innovation. Particularly in this concept of anticipatory governance. And I think that links quite clearly to Paul's discussion, which was on uncertainty. How do we actually make decisions under uncertainty? Why are we even using the future or thinking about the future? It's largely to make decisions in the present. And I think that's relevant for a variety of different actors, whether they're coming from the business sector or civil society or government or even research. We all need to be anticipating our actions in the present. And just to give a broad sense of what's happening in diverse contexts around the world and in different ecosystems, so we can see the relevance of these frameworks, of the way that we've been thinking about the future in different contexts and in different places. So I usually start, for those of you who've been in some of my talks before, with a short imagining session where, if you feel comfortable, I can invite all of you to just close your eyes and think of the year 2100, where we got everything right. We managed to achieve the Paris Agreement. We managed to achieve the Global Biodiversity Framework targets and goals. We managed to achieve the SDGs, maybe not by 2030, but we got there eventually. What does the world look like if we manage to achieve all of these goals we've set ourselves? What does it look like for Japan, for Tokyo, for Sweden, France, New Zealand, South Africa? Where you live right now, what would that world look like? So that you can open your eyes. For me, that's really, really difficult to do. We don't have those tools that tell us how a preferable future could look if we actually did the things we have committed to do. And that's because, as Gary was mentioning, we're surrounded by these headlines. So these are from previous years. We could do very similar ones literally in the past week around fires that have been in South Korea based on the wind that exactly was stopping us on the Shinkansen yesterday. Looking at the fires in LA, this was coming off the fires in Australia, right? Now we're sort of looking at similar levels of destruction. And so we're surrounded by these rightly very dystopian narratives of where it is we are heading in this, if you want to call business as usual scenario. And the stories we tell ourselves about these futures reinforce that. So don't look up, sixth extinction. It's easy to imagine a complete collapse in Australia of water wars in Mad Max Fury Road, and sort of the subsequent ones. The really good Apple TV show called Extrapolations, which does a terrifyingly good job of extrapolating from the present into the future if we continue as we do around climate, biodiversity, around rich billionaires pretending to save us from ourselves but holding on to things until 2080, when suddenly, where they're able to put the solutions out into the world. And so this really is, I think, a crisis of the imagination that we are confronted by, because it's really easy to tell dystopian stories. It's really hard to tell stories of hope or preference or aspiration. And that's because, we're also sitting in this epoch, if you want to call it that, of the Anthropocene, which Gary has also been mentioning, it's new. It's something we haven't experienced before. It's turbulent. It's getting faster, hyper-connected. If COVID taught us one thing, it taught us that. But at the same time, it's also highly unequal. So different parts of the world were growing further away from each other rather than closer together. And I think the fragile geopolitics that we're seeing playing out at the moment is reinforcing these dynamics too. So how do we act in this kind of system? There have been various other diagnoses of this concept, whether it's the Cluthlocene, which is a Donna Haraway concept, which is about sort of making kin more relational ties with more than human or not just human actors. This idea of the Capitalocene, which is that it's actually capital that's largely driving the pathologies that Gary was mentioning. I've seen the Manocene, which is a gendered feminist take of this idea. So I think, even if we're not calling it a new geographical epoch, that there's an important way of framing this period within which we find ourselves and being able to diagnose some of these indirect drivers, which I think was also mentioned initially by Saito-san. And so I come back to this, and I think it was Gary who actually introduced me to this quote originally. William Gibson, who's a science fiction writer from the 80s, who said, "The future's already here, it's just unevenly distributed." And so the idea of the Seeds Project, that future, that the sort of what is going to emerge is already existing today in the seeds that we see around us. And this is both for good and bad, right? So you can see that the sort of the climate chaos of the future is playing out in these wildfires, in these flood events, in these things that people are experiencing right now in the world. But also potentially the solutions of the future are also present now. Sort of the innovations, the technologies, the returning reconnections to nature and place that are starting to take forward. And how can we find and identify those aspirational futures that are with us in the present that we want to help take and grow using the seeds concept that Gary was explaining? And how do we counter the potentially negative futures that we want to make sure are declining into the future that we start to build? And so what ultimately do aspirational futures for people and nature look like? And this is something really important that we need to start to unpack if we're actually going to realize this 2050 vision on living in harmony with nature, which is what the Convention on Biological Diversity asks us to do. It's a vision, but what does it tangibly mean to live in harmony with nature? And one would think that if we all were able to imagine that world in 2100, every single one of us in this room would have a different conceptualization of what that is. And that diversity is legitimate and it's important. There might be a more collective understanding if we were thinking about Japan, for example, me living in South Africa, but there would be commonalities that we could draw on. It's about being able to understand those and to understand where the plurality, where the diversity is actually important. It's messy, it's hard to deal with, it's uncertain, but it's also something that we need to learn to be more comfortable with if we're going to be navigating towards actually this idea of living in harmony with nature. So we've seen this. Gary, I think, was the only one that didn't make some sort of reference to this report, even though he was an author on it. Exactly. In the previous talk, he has that. So I won't go through this. I think Carolyn and Paul have already done a very good job of setting out why scenarios for global diversity are important tools and how we should use them. I'm going to be referring to them in terms of the current narratives that we've been used have been the shared socio-economic pathways, which also, as Carolyn and Paul was mentioning, were really useful to think of a climate change perspective, challenges to adaptation, challenges to mitigation. But they're not talking about challenges to biodiversity loss or challenges to geopolitical instability or challenges to complete breakdown in trade, right, that we're seeing playing around. And so we need to think of more relevant storylines for biodiversity, for this question of living in harmony with nature. And that's what we were tasked to do as the expert group that emerged after the report was negotiated. Well, the SPM was negotiated in 2016 into a participatory process that Carolyn actually hosted for us in New Zealand in 2017, into the development, the first round of the Nature Futures Framework that Carolyn presented to us earlier. And along the way, we started to think about stories. So not just to think about sort of what are the databases of information that we need to be able to fill in order to do the models. That was an important component, but it wasn't the only component. It was also asking us to take a step back, to think maybe more qualitatively, to be able to engage diverse knowledge systems, which is a very important component of the IPBES conceptual framework, but also the pinning ethos of how the platform works. And so we had engagements, even though it was over COVID, they were online with our Indigenous and local knowledge task force. And these were some of the images, the artistic representations of the discussions that emerged from those engagements, with Africa on the left, Asia in the middle, and the Americas on the right. And these were different ways of starting to think through, okay, what are the futures we want to see? What are the stories? How do we think about time? What are the ways of presenting these that diverse knowledge systems are able to engage with and potentially communicate more effectively? And so ultimately, we went through this negotiated evolution from just the triangle on the left through to the Nature Futures Framework, which was negotiated in plenary as a flexible tool to support the development of scenarios and models of desirable futures for people, nature, and Mother Earth. So there was a definite link to acknowledging Indigenous knowledge systems in particular in that. And that to understand that, we can conceptualize within the triangle these different value perspectives that Carolyn was mentioning and giving tangible examples of. But ultimately, what we've also reflected on is that we all hold multiple values for nature in multiple different ways, in multiple places, in multiple times, right? And that messy intersection or connectivity is actually probably a true reflection of how this aspirational we're sitting outside the triangle right now. How do we think about getting towards a more preferable, diverse value for nature-centered future? That is probably a lot messier, like that diagram on the right, but it's really hard for us to model that or to bring that into our scientific way of thinking. But we should never forget that there are important threads and connections, and that we can draw commonalities between or intersections between how different people around the world, how different knowledge systems actually think about the future, and that it's important to always bear that in mind when we're going into processes and starting to become a little bit more rigid in how we approach the problem. So there've been many uses for the Nature Futures Framework. The one that I've been most involved with, and that I'll be presenting some examples of here, is this idea of visioning. It's trying to do what I asked you to do in the opening slide. It's that visioning. Where do we want to go? What are we aspiring towards? What are the value systems that we want to take with us? What is that? What am I eating in that future? What does the finance system look like in the future? how are we relating to nature? Then how to identify some of the pathways, right? That's great to envision that, as Gary was mentioning in that adapted 3 horizons framework. But what are the steps we need to take in order to achieve those pathways? How does that current system decline as the new system starts to grow? What does that messy conflict in the middle actually look like from a practical planning perspective? Because we need that orientation. We need to know where we're bending the curve towards. But then we also need to realize that there's going to be uncertainty and messiness, but we can still come up with some plans, some steps, some actions that a diverse set of actors can take in order to achieve those futures. With that, there's also this idea of narrative development. So I made reference to to William Gibson, who's a science fiction writer. We quite often use storylines when we're thinking of doing scenario modeling. So there is this notion of we need a qualitative idea of what this world is, what this future looks like when we start putting numbers to it. But as humans, we also tell stories all the time, right? All of those movie posters that I put up, those are stories. Those are stories that impact us, that we have conversations about, that we think about. And they're in a way that we can move beyond just an academic discourse, and we can engage literally with everyone, because I don't think there's a human on this planet that doesn't tell stories in some way, shape, size, or form, right? This idea of narrative development, I think, is also crucial. And we've been collaborating with speculative fiction writers, actually, and artists to try and see how we can tell different stories based on the participatory research we've been doing. And Gary just shared one that he wrote from a workshop we did in coastal Kenya a year ago now. From that, there's also qualitative modeling that we can do. So modeling doesn't just have to be sort of big integrated assessment models. It can also be more qualitative, sort of causal loop diagrams, feedbacks. There's also the quantitative modeling, and that's really important. I mean, as Paul was putting out, when he was mentioning the forestry decision making, without actually understanding all of those different model outputs, we wouldn't be able to actually make more effective decisions. Like, you also need some of those biophysical realities that only the numbers can really tell us, because cognitively we can't deal with all of that. We also need the quantitative modeling, and we need to constantly be improving and updating our models. And I think that's something that the S-21 project is really fantastic at doing. It's sort of taking all of these gaps that we've recognized and is trying to muddle through. Not saying we're going to solve all of the problems right now, but we need to start making attempts. And then, what is it we're measuring? What are these indicators? What is, when you think about that future in 2100, what would an indicator of we got things right, of success, actually look like? What would we be measuring? Is it the same thing we're measuring now? I would say in some instances, yes, but in many instances, probably no, right? Maybe our notions of development or growth or finance investment actually being attractive or impactful is a different metric to what we're using right now. So we also need to imagine what those different indicators could or should be in the future. And that then comes back into what it is we land up modeling in the first instance. So we, as a expert group and task force combined, also went through a process of developing what we've called illustrative narratives using the Nature Futures framework. So it's not a definitive set of these are the only scenarios of how the future world could look, but we needed to play around with the edges of the triangle. Like, if we were to go down some extreme edges that were still preferable, what could these worlds look like? And so it was actually a process hosted here in Japan at IGES in 2020, just as the Diamond Princess was coming back. And I saw them when I landed, saw the sign when I landed at the airport, and got a bit sort of a traumatic response, because that was when COVID got released, I think, in Japan. But we were here and we spent 5 days together just thinking through how would we cut the triangle, right, to actually get degrees of difference across the edges based on ongoing discussions that were happening in the literature, which were saying that there's, land sparing versus land sharing is an important debate within agriculture, neither of which is fundamentally correct at the expense of the other, but they're different value perspectives that you're actually emphasizing. The whole earth versus half earth notion of how do we actually look at conservation from an economic perspective, this idea of green growth as an option versus degrowth, which has also been put forward. And we need to be unpacking these different sort of continua of options. And this was our attempt as a task force. And so we did this. As you can see on the top left hand, that's how we cut. We use those examples I just gave across the triangle. And also use the sides. I love the sides, not just the corners of the triangle. I think they help us play in messier spaces, sort of set them out along different continua. So we knew we had at least enough divergence or diversity across the narratives. And we came up with some stories that are in a paper that Paz Duran, one of our fellows, published. We've also used them in quantitative modeling examples. So this was done by a postdoc in Peter Verburg's lab at Freya University in the Netherlands. And these are plural land use scenarios for Europe that was using the Nature Futures Framework edges. And this was published in 2023, just to show, what could, if we did take these two extremes, what would land use change actually look like? But ultimately, the idea is that we need to tell better science stories, right? So it's all very good and well to see the map or to sort of see these axes, but what are the stories? I keep on coming back to stories. And it wasn't just me that said that. There was an editorial in Nature in 2018 that also said that we need to do that based on a colleague at SRC's PhD thesis called Radical Ocean Futures. What are these better science stories? And I'm going to spend the last 10 minutes that I have sort of talking through what my ideas of these are with examples of how we've tried to translate that using the Nature Futures Framework. So the first is imagination. I talk about this imagination gap that we have in our ability to imagine things going right in the future. Ben Okri, who's a famous Nigerian writer, talks about knowledge is empty without imagination and that no civilization became great on knowledge alone. There's another really important point made already in 1992 on imagination helps us transcend conventional thinking. And in particularly sort of at that point where stable facts and data mix in with shifting emotions, memories, and intentions. And I think when we talk about scenarios, that's exactly the interface we're sitting at. We've got stable facts, we've got numbers, but we've also got emotions, we've got aspirations and values, and we need to recognize the intersection between them. And then this quote from Beck in 1992, I started putting this up years ago when we were starting to see the geopolitical fracturing that has become extremely evident this year. But this idea of people being unable or unwilling to incorporate novelty into the way that they think about the future, or to find a place for the unknowable, being comfortable with uncertainty, makes the lived experience of change disorienting, and it promotes defensive and nostalgic reactions. And I think that that's largely what you're starting to see in sort of the rise of the right, is this defense, this nostalgic reaction for a past that never was, right? That was never actually like that, but that we're experiencing change. Oh my gosh, the immigrants are coming, or like our economic system or climate change, they're telling us to change things. We don't have a capacity to deal with that uncertainty. And so we become defensive, right? And we start to other, and we start to go back to a past that never happened. This idea of imagination can help us to potentially transcend some of those features to actually incorporate diversity or uncertainty into the way we go about doing things. The second is multiple knowledge systems, right? That we can't do this alone just from one perspective, that we need to weave and appreciate multiple different ways of seeing together, and not necessarily to integrate these knowledge systems, because there is a hierarchy, there is a power domination of particular ways that tend to capture ways of seeing. So we can't sacrifice equity on the altar of integration. We need to recognize these as distinct, but we can weave, we can recognize, we can appreciate these different knowledge systems. And this is really vital when it comes to being able to imagine what these futures could look like. And the third is a participatory process, as both Paul and Gary were saying, that most critical aspect of scenarios is that you need to bring people with you on the journey. You can't just suddenly throw a story at them and say, oh, this is what the world is, go and do something about it. It needs to be participatory. We need to get again, diverse perspectives, different ways of seeing together in a room to go through that imaginative journey to build this anticipatory capacity as we go along. But we can't always bring the whole world together in a room, right? So how do we start to make better participatory processes and practices? And as we move forward, I think this is sometimes the hardest thing that we can actually do, is to make sure that we have an inclusive process in how we think about the future. And so this science fiction that I keep on going on about, I really love this quote by Ivor Hartman, who put together the first anthology of African speculative fiction in 2012. And what you sort of emphasize here is that the reason that science fiction, speculative fiction is so important, particularly for African writers, is that if you can't see and relay an understandable vision of the future, your future will be co-opted by someone else's vision, and they may not necessarily have your best interests at heart. And I think that's largely the story of the continent I come from, a development paradigm. You want to do this, you need to do that. This is our vision for what Africa should be. Very little agency given to people across the continent to be able to feed into that. And so we're trying to counter that with some of the narratives and stories and processes that we've been doing. But I think this is about that inclusion perspective, that is not about dictating what these futures should look like. And so we ran a process with the Ngoni people in the north of Malawi and came up with a speculative fiction anthology that you can see there. And actually, the second story, Heraith, was longlisted for the British Science Fiction Awards. So we were quite excited and happy with that. You can also see some artwork representing, I think it's clear which parts of the triangle those were coming from as part of that collaboration. We also did it for the high seas. And this is the part when I'm lecturing, I tend to ask my class, can you tell me, if I was to point at that one, which corner of the triangle that is? Come on, guys. Just shout it out. It's not that hard. Yeah, say it loudly, Gary. Nature for nature. That's exactly it. That's nature for nature. Nature is culture and nature for society. So again, you don't need language. We also get really dominated by English in the academic world. But this, I can take these images to various parts of the world and people will be able to engage with them without being constrained by my having to explain it in English or in French or in Afrikaans. Yeah, so there we go. There's the triangle. We also did it for coral reef systems. So one of the most fragile, vulnerable sort of ecosystems of the planet. How can we think of what a safe and just space could be for coral reefs? Is there such a thing? And we were hearing about how coral reefs are displacing kelp forests actually in Japan, and thinking that that's an interesting value-based discussion that we can start to have about what are the types of ecosystems that we think of as preferable, that we have cultural connections to. And we had 3 different stories, again, emerging from the edges, the sides of the triangle, based on that process we ran in Moria last year. And Ignacio, our postdoc, is writing that up at the moment. Again, different types of futures emerging, but all of them preferable, thinking through what coral reefs could look like. And then we just came off out of a workshop in Benin with my PhD students in Apon in January this year, thinking through desirable futures in the monotransboundary corridor between Benin and Togo, focusing specifically on mangroves, actually, where, unlike in New Zealand, they're actually being eroded and degraded, and we want to bring them back. And we want to think through what are some of the indigenous practices like Zangbeto or other kinds of voodoo. So voodoo is actually recognized as the main religion in Benin. What are these practices that have been for generations practiced within the region to protect the mangroves? So don't fish over here or don't cut down here. We're actually going back in, and we had I was privileged enough to experience actually one of these practices going forward of the Zangbeton. And you can see we also had some performances of what some of these features are. And so that is another way that we start to showcase the creativity, the imagination, by being able to perform, not just have sticky notes on a board or a report, but an actual embedded performance, which tends to stick with us a lot more clearly. And I think Carolyn's smiling because she's remembering some that we had initially in New Zealand a couple of years ago. And so this is my final slide. And it's more food for thought than it is anything else. I think what we've been able to do as a breakthrough within the Nature Futures framework is take a lot of these messy ideas of aspirations and values and what are nature-human relations and what are diverse knowledge systems and how can we think through them to inform decision-making. Ultimately, at the end of the day, there is that very practical aspect to talking through these stories. But it doesn't really deal with diverse concepts of time. It doesn't also help us unpack problematic histories that we bring into the presence that we embody. If we're thinking from a more equitable perspective, if we think through, and this is a time tree going up rather than left to right, yeah, sort of rather than linear time as sort of just a singular idea of we move from the past into the present. And there was in Gary's initial presentation, a futures code that you can take a look at, which is built on that. But this is the Akan idea of Sankofa, which is a bird that sort of goes forward whilst looking backwards, holding the beads of past generations with it as it goes forward. So thinking of that connection to the ancestors and to land, which I think in Japan is also a really important concept, right? Of having that connection to land, to ancestors, to history. Or for other sort of worldviews that just think of time as cyclical, right? Rather than linear. How do we start to appreciate these modes of engaging and delve even more into the plurality of these multiple presents that we embody in different places around the world, acknowledging that they're myths and they're erased histories that we can't actually take with us, but that we can try and hold on to as we open up for the types of aspirational futures that we want to take with us. And that is it. Humans have changed the way the world works, and now we have to change the way we think about it too, which is The Economist already in 2011. Thanks.
Thank you, Lola. Thank you very much connecting all the previous presentation nicely within your presentation. And I really like that these, NFF, reviewing NFF development and how it can use for imagination and also the capturing multiple value systems and also participatory process and create examples from the African continent under the different, the socio-ecological settings. So thank you very much. So we would like to move on to the kind of Q&A and discussion. So I would like to ask all the presenters to sit in front. And then according to my colleagues, we don't get any comments from online participants so far at this point, but we're expecting that also the online participants can send their Q&A questions through the Zoom system. But meanwhile, I would like to invite the in-person participation, on-site participants to ask, and is there any questions you would like to ask to the speakers here? Anyone? Yeah. Oh, then I can start. Maybe yeah, Kisan, can you present my last page of my presentation? Yeah, so this is the one I prepared before the workshop and before this meeting symposium. Yeah, so it's three major questions is about you already mentioned that the key challenge is to realize that the nature positive futures and how to overcome it. Maybe you can revisit what point you'd like to highlight again. Or you can also, after hearing the others' presentations, if you would like to add on what you already presented. So that's the first point. The other point is that since we already observed many ongoing wildfires in Tohoku and also Korea and other areas, of course, in Los Angeles. So that we also need to really how we can really simultaneously cope with the nature positive futures in line with meeting, achieving climate change and also the disaster prevention, disaster risk reduction. So these should be achieved simultaneously. So then what important point we should also consider. Of course, there is no silver bullet, but yeah, if you have any thought or any examples, the area or the people, the group who are working on this topic explicitly, if you have anything know about this, then yeah, please share with us. And the last point is that yeah, any expectation and the message, not the message, to Japanese researcher in Japan or also the government and the private businesses. So these are three kind of broad, the points we would like to hear from all of you. So you can respond one of those or two of those or yeah, anyone. So, Scully. Oh, please.
Okay, right. The message to Japanese researchers and government. I think it's both. See, today there's lots of really great research in Japan, and Japan has a really fantastic capacity to look at these multiple nature values, where I think the nature's cultural values are both really important in Japan and actually pretty well studied, which is not the case everywhere else. However, I think what I'd say is really a message. I think it'd be really great if this research and knowledge in Japan was better connected with the rest of the world. I think somewhere like Sweden has a lot of similarities actually to Japan and in Europe in general, but there's not so much knowledge exchange, even though there are, of course, we have research collaborations, but nice to see more of that. And I think that also goes with things like corporate reporting around sustainability. And the activities of the Japanese government and companies. It would be really great if these could be more aligned. Japan is one of the biggest investors globally, and it would be nice if the nature positive message could get beyond the Ministry of the Environment into the Ministry of Finance, because as we've all said, it doesn't matter if the financiers don't care about nature. Nature cares about them, and just like supposedly, Trotsky said, it's like, it doesn't matter if you don't care about the war cares about you, and it's going to come and get you whether you do it or not. So I think it's really this message that central banks and prudent financial management and governance has to think about these risks. And this is something I think that Japan could really be a leader on, but needs to, especially in the world we are today, Japan is moving forward with this, unlike the US and the EU, which have backed off, but to work together with partners and try and get good scientific-based standards for companies, for government activities, and try and align things more. Like we saw both wonderful things up in the tsunami-affected areas, and I think also some pretty poor things with these of tsunami infrastructure, which the local people do not like. They were not consulted on, and is basically a huge waste of Japan taxpayer money to make the world worse. And so to try and reform these things, to try and I think there's quite a bit of research that shows that, but to try and do things where it would have been so easy to do something, work with nature to help people in nature and these nature values. So I think that's a challenge, to dismantle some of these pathologies, but to work for that is be really wonderful, and Japan could teach the world a lot with that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Gary. Anyone else? Paul?
So is that working?
Yes.
Okay. So what are the challenges and what are some of the biggest challenges we've faced? I think one of the biggest challenges, at least at the global scale, is that especially since this initiative came out of IPBES, they were expecting things to happen like they did in IPCC, where IPCC set out and they said, well, we're going to have these 4 main socioeconomic pathways where we're going to prescribe for each one of those things what population growth is, how much accent they're going to put on these different energy pathways. And many papers come out explaining exactly how you translate fairly qualitative storylines into quantitative storylines. And they thought, and what happened out of the task force is basically we came up with very broad qualitative descriptions of what nature futures framework could look like and what nature positive futures are, with very relative little guidance on how that actually could be converted into something more quantitative. And so a lot of the people working on quantitative scenarios and on quantitative models of transcribing drivers into impacts on biodiversity ecosystem services is we don't know what to do with this. And what's really important about the S-21 initiative, and there are a few other initiatives like this globally, but I don't think I've seen any that are as ambitious as the S-21, is that it's demonstrating or trying to demonstrate how you take this very sort of qualitative description of what nature's futures framework is, why it's important for positive visions of the future, and turn that into something quantitative and associate it with a lot of the qualitative work that you're doing. It remains a huge challenge for you, but we need exactly this kind of thing going on in many places in the world. And, you know, I think this is just a fantastic initiative. I think it was the primary roadblock challenge that we were facing in trying to expand the use of nature's future framework and think about positive futures.
Thank you. Caroline, please. Microphone.
I'll go next and potentially, if I get this on, potentially this applies a bit to both 1 and 3, but maybe even 2. I know my own experience in New Zealand is our government and all of our government agencies are very fragmented. So I think we're unusual in a positive way that we have both the Ministry for the Environment and Department of Conservation. Why we have 2 and not 1 doesn't always make sense. Department of Conservation manages parks as well as managing conservation and marine protected areas and threatened species and all sorts of other things. But the disconnect with things like our Ministry for Primary Industries, our Ministry for Social Development, our Ministry of Statistics, they're all different agencies and they're often working independently, doing the same thing, spending, you know, in the current world, our resources for environmental monitoring, for even informing decisions on scenarios and models and what we're going to do is very limited. And when we get everybody together in the same room, and, you know, I've done a lot of work in the Pacific as well, we find a lot of the agencies are collecting the same information and wasting resources and not talking to each other. And you'll have everyone has got their own geospatial database of what biodiversity layers they collect or what fisheries impacts or other things or land-based impacts, but there's very little coordination. And so, you know, in my case, I think that's one of the biggest things that we can change is getting that better coordination. I hope that's better in Japan than it is, but certainly all the countries that I've worked in, we do see a consistent pattern where each of our ministries has their patch and there's very little coordination across. And it's hard when you're, you know, not using what resources you do have as a nation wisely to actually get to that collaborative solution. And then recognizing, for example, with our Ministry of Primary Industries, how dependent they are on Ministry of the Environment doing the job of managing the environment. So those connections across government, I think, are a key challenge.
Yeah, it's the same in Japan too. Yeah. Thank you very much. And Lola?
Put it up. Does it work? Yep, great. So I'm going to take a slightly different tack. It's exactly the same in South Africa. So I think that's a broader governance issue that we face when we think about these things. And I think we need to recognize the difficulty that we now face of thinking through this notion of positive or desirable when we are facing on a day-to-day basis these really negative impacts, whether it's fires, floods, wars, genocides, right? And it's about, again, being able to build that hopeful, imaginative capacity, which I don't think we should underestimate how difficult that really is. And I think that's one of our biggest challenges, is that when we wake up and we're faced with these sorts of things happening around us, it's hard to be hopeful, right? But it's essential, I would say, if we're going to do some of this work. And so that sort of is my response to 1 and 2, and it leads into my response on 3, which is don't be afraid of stories and of emotions and of being honest and true about these things that we are experiencing right now. I think we try and go back into hard facts, data. This is what we've come out, and that really hasn't helped us get places. It's important, right? And we need to know the facts that are on the table. But at the same time, we need to recognize we're dealing with humans, and humans are messy and complex, and nature is also messy and complex. And maybe we need to appreciate the stories, maybe appreciate a little bit more the discomfort that we know we are going to have to go through if we're thinking through actual transformative change, if we are thinking about these radical reconfigurations of societal relationships, of how our economies work, of how our governance systems work, of how we relate to each other and to nature, it's going to be uncomfortable, but it's still really important work. And I think we're at that moment where this is something that we need to start internalizing in how we all make decisions, no matter what sector of society we represent. And I think that's the main sort of message, is embrace imagination and storytelling, and don't be afraid to be a little bit uncomfortable in situations.
Thank you very much. That's a very important point.
I might have a
Yeah.
follow-up if I can on Laura's point. I think one of the other things that we've found, that discomfort with change, often scenarios, we have a business as usual scenario. Everyone likes business as usual. Everyone likes to know that, what they're currently doing will still be retained if you have a job. I was talking to someone on the break, I think, but in looking at our coastal restoration, we have a lot of jobs based on, or not coastal restoration, in our biosecurity monitoring in New Zealand. We have jobs based on an invasive algae being there and being eradicated. So we have many people employed that don't want Undaria to be a harvested resource, because that means then it'll be allowed everywhere and they'll lose their job. But recognizing that the challenge of the business as usual and the barriers to change. And so where that comes in scenarios is one of the things we did quite a few years ago with one of my postdocs, Kate Davies, that I think knows everybody else here. We did some scenarios that at that point in time we called humorously, we have 3 positive and 3 negative ones, and we called them the Trump and the Obama scenarios. At that point in time, it was funny then. It's a bit less funny right now. But within those scenarios, the key thing that people were giving us feedback to was they could understand how the Trump scenarios would happen, but they couldn't understand, unless a major catastrophe happened, they couldn't see how we would ever get to people getting outside of their comfort zone of what we're already doing and moving to that change. And I think that was, particularly the aquaculture in the Bay yesterday, the day before that we visited, it was very much we had low productivity. We had too many people harvesting. It was primarily single species. Then we had to change because the tsunami, wrecked the boats, wrecked the system. And then we came up with something different where there are less lines, but everyone's making more money, potentially more productive fisheries, healthier aquaculture. But it required the disaster to get there. How do we enact positive change without, when you're kind of in this constant state of decline, but it never goes straight down? How do we get people to be willing to make the change before it's too late and make that positive change?
Thank you very much. So, yeah, Hiroe? Yeah, wait for the microphone.
So can I ask a question to Laura and Gary? Okay, Laura, I totally agree with you that the reality is messy and, you know, nature is very messy, especially when we deal with biodiversity and nature. But I think the problem is that when we are to communicate with policymakers, they like the simple story. They also need to justify how we use the finance, you know, their budget and so forth. So they really need a clear, you know, simple story. And to me, like, I'm a sociologist and anthropologist, so I like messy and I like to describe the messy situation. But then when we communicate with the policymakers, I think it's, you know, I have a difficult instances where I do need to, you know, sometimes really simplify. And to me, I feel a little bit guilty when I do that because it kind of, you know, ignores some of the voices at the local stakeholder level. And I feel that that's going to impact when we think about environmental justice and so forth. So how do we deal with this complexity, especially when we are dealing with corporations and governments? And for you, Gary, yeah, how do you deal? I do totally agree with you that, you know, finance is the key and it's really important to have, you know, transforming finance so that it will lead to nature positive. But then they are well, like when we look at the really big, you know, finance, they're working at the global scale. And I think for me, like, how do you deal with things like environmental justice and like the people who are marginalized in this kind of, you know, when we seek the policy for nature positive?
Thank you.
Yeah. So yes. But I think, and this is really why I wanted to emphasize that aspect of story, discomfort, messiness, and it's largely to businesses and to government officials, etc., who want information, that the messiness is not going to go away, no matter how simple that the message is that we put forward. That messiness and complexity is not going to go away. And I think that you can still, which is why I come back to stories. I think the way we tell stories, we can get complexity in a way that can be communicated and understood relatively well. And I think that we're getting better at that art, different ways of actually engaging, but they need to be seen as legitimate. And I think that's the big difficulty that we face, is that SSP's graphs, this is going here, that's going here, that's going here, is a very clear outcome that can be visually communicated quite well. All the sort of underpinning assumptions of, well, actually 4 of these are really bad and this is unlikely to whatever, you know, that the messiness of how this plays or impacts in other parts of the world, for example, isn't necessarily as well incorporated. And so my pushback is actually, I think, at that science policy interface, and by policy, I'm taking government, business into account too, right? So decision-making space is that, yes, we can help in that translation, in the communication, but I don't think in the simplification. And I think that's where we're falling short. We need to communicate better, but maybe we also need some go from the other side and meeting us to understand that some of this is a bit more complex and difficult, and that we need to meet each other halfway. And I think the final point is that participatory aspect, is that quite often it's not just a policymaker that doesn't understand the complexity. You need to have gone through that process yourself. When we're talking about building anticipatory capacities, sometimes it just requires you to take that time to go through the process, to have that cognitive aha moment as a decision maker, as someone sort of in a business, etc. And businesses have run scenarios for decades, right? And gone through these processes and recognized the importance of them, right? As have governments. South Africa went through that in the 1994 transition. So actually taking that time, if this is really important, take that time, go through the process, actually work through those complex cognitive gymnastics that you need to do to understand the situation better, would be my sort of maybe further attempt at that. So yes, we need to communicate better, but maybe that simplification is where we've been going wrong a lot of the time, and we need to actually hold on to that complexity.
All right, so I'm gonna transition, but sort of start off with the messiness. So I think one of the things that can be useful is to talk to different decision makers. So to go back to what Paul was talking about, I was contacted by a network for greening the financial system to tell them about the IPES scenarios. And I was saying like, well, you know, we didn't make scenarios. We don't have any representative. They're like, yeah, we know that. We know that. And what they were interested in is like, we don't care about the likely futures. We care about the unlikely events that could have a big impact on the economy. And so we don't want this kind of smooth line into the future. We want to know the variance around that. And we want to know what bits of that variance could impact what parts of the economy so we can make sure that there's some kind of stress testing of institutions that they can cope with these shocks that may never happen. So I think that's also a thing of thinking about who you're talking to and that these different actors need different answers. And then if you're working, so I would say that like, I think our center believes that like you should work with a wide variety of actors from indigenous people to these you know, like big giant fishing companies that have all sorts of human slavery as well as overfishing issues. Because like if you just work with the marginal, you can help protect the marginal, but you're never going to change the big dominant systems. And so one of the things working with both is potential to kind of connect them together from both ends. And say when we're working with finance, I think we're both thinking about like, what are the goals that people can take today? Given that wherever you're going, you can't spend forever thinking about what's the best pathway forward to some ultimate goal. You have to take a step. Any journey has to start with a step. And we don't know this terrain. We don't know what's going to happen. But you want to have some goals and some criteria to think about to evaluate things as you're going. So my PhD advisor was a guy, Buzz Holly, is one of the fathers of resilience. And he really saw resilience as a science of surprise, of how do you cope with and prepare for surprise. And I think this is something that a lot of science and economics is kind of provided, but actually business, as Laura was saying, does it a lot. I had a friend who used to lead a big part of a big tech company that was about basically building adaptive capacity of developing prototypes of products, not to develop and sell, but to figure out what was going on in this turbulent marketplace. They need to be like, this is a scam. This one we want to watch more. This one we should buy right now, but for no more than $2 billion or for any price they want. And to have that inside the company, which is, these kind of things are quite common in certain spaces in business. And I think this kind of thinking about having some creative destruction, like having prescribed fires. Some places, they just don't want to have any disturbance. You need to have some disturbance, but do it in a humane way. You need to make sure you keep knowledge that's around to cope with change, and it's on the margins. We should be mobilizing it and getting something really a lot of potential in Japan that is appreciated. And this kind of making sure that crisis and transformation are safe and the marginal are protected, which I think you can look at responses from COVID around the world that some countries and places did this much better or much worse than the other. So I think there are lots of kind of principles you can use to navigate and move forward. And also this kind of having these bigger, longer term goals can help motivate the people and the humans who work in these big companies of that they maybe don't personally also like their company, and you want to help the people who want to maybe transform it in a good transition against people who maybe want to go in a different way, and think about what you can do to have that change. So I think that's a whole bunch of things, but I think to keep the big picture, but not to expect that you have a perfect plan for everything before you act, right? That's a trap as well.
Thank you very much. I think there is one question.
Yes, we received one question from the online participant. I'm going to read out. So some of the photographs the presenter showed today still inspire my dreams. In reality, there are man-made objects in nature, and these objects belong to humans. It may be fine while they are still in use, but it is very painful to see the contrast between nature and man-made objects that have become old, abandoned, and in ruins. Can nature and man-made objects coexist? Is it unreasonable to think that we should be responsible for the man-made objects we create until the very end? Is this something that should be ignored as economically impossible?
And everyone knows not quite the man-made objects that maybe I'll mention, but I was fascinated with the learning about the abandoned forestry and the abandoned farmlands in Japan, which I, didn't really have a concept of how big of an issue that is. And if you consider those, forest blocks as probably not what the person online is asking about in terms of man-made objects, but I mean, that is a man-made forest, and how different is that from what a native forest would be? And, even looking at, we had a fantastic conversation with Sato, I don't remember his first name, about the, different rotations that he had within the forest block, some being, 150-year rotations versus 50 to 60-year rotations on which type of plant or which tree and what it was being used for. And I know, talking with our indigenous Maori as well, they would have very much man-made forests, 1,000 years ago, where they were having particular trees they were, letting grow for a particular canoe or waka. So there would be the tree that they were saving and making sure it was well nourished for 100 or 500 years for a different generation. So I think, we've had man-made or man-made changes to the landscape for thousands of years, but how do we bring in a lot of what we're doing now? I think what, Gary was probably referring to is the thing that struck us the most visually in Minami San Rico was how the whole river and the tidal estuary has all been channelized. And it's the first thing you see is these cement blocks and structures that is no longer what I'd consider to be a river. And in, New Zealand has some cities that have that type of channelized framework through the river, and it's very artificial. I know I did my undergraduate degree in Los Angeles. The LA River is a channel in concrete. It's not a proper river. How do things live in it? How do you turn that into nature? And, something that's quite challenging in my hometown. We don't have quite the channelized culverts and things. We have a lot of gully restoration where we're trying to make more land around our rivers. We do have the largest river in New Zealand going through, but recognizing that it does change over time and does often take out man-made structures because they're no longer able to be there. So I think a lot of it is, one, recognizing that man-made isn't just the artificial structure, it's also the changes we make to the landscape to make them suitable for what we want them to. But maybe someone else can talk more with the more artificial structures, how we integrate them.
I can just say anyway very quickly. I think both Japan and Europe, the main nature that people appreciate and value is this nature for culture. And what they particularly value are the harmonious nature and culture where there's beautiful buildings in a human created landscape like Satayama, or in the wine regions of France, or the archipelago outside Stockholm, where there's some harmony between the human built artifacts and the natural world. And this is also with many indigenous societies, like where I'm originally from, the Haida people, or many of the Pacific Northwest indigenous people, they build structures out of wood, and they design them to decay. And as part of their respect is not to keep it stuck, but as carve a tree and have a pole, let it fall over and go back to the forest. And I think this is very much like the Shinto temples of recreating them every few years, that there's this kind of idea that you can build in harmony with nature. And that would ideally be a world that you could go towards that doesn't have to be even separated from nature. You can also think about the nature of society of where you have a managed ecosystem where people are getting good benefits sustainably from that nature. And it's a different type of beautiful, productive system, even if it doesn't have such strong culture values. It's sustainable and strong. So I think human artifacts in nature can be terrible, but they can also be harmonious.
Thank you, Gary. I think that nicely summarizes what the key points we would like to share. So now, yeah, Paul.
If I could just add to that with a very specific example. So in France, they're working on making streams, many of which are not natural because they've been dammed. There's lots of obstacles for fish and organisms to move up and down rivers, and that's it's called the recreating the blue connections in France. And in order to do that, they're removing all these structures, dams and things like that. So for some of those structures, which essentially have been abandoned and are ugly and have no cultural value, those get taken out and nobody objects. So from that standpoint, there's not much to question of values or whether or not that should be done. Many of those, though, are associated with that things that people value. So some of those dams, people actually like them because there are different fish there and they like to fish there. And that's actually having negative impacts on sort of natural connections within these streams, but the fishermen actually value those. And that's why the Nature's Future Framework, I think, provides a really interesting perspective on how to address these kinds of value difference. Some of those dams are there to help provide water for mills, and some of those mills actually still work, but they're creating obstruction to animals moving up and down the rivers. And so removing them is getting rid of these very important sort of cultural components of rivers. And so one has to understand these differences in values, and many of them associated with kinds of things that we're thinking about in Nature's Future Framework, of valuing ecosystem services versus nature for nature and things like that. And can actually help think about even issues like whether or not you should leave man-made structures out in nature.
Thank you, Paul. So now we would like to finish this the symposium. So I'd like to invite Wataru-san to give the final closing remarks. So Suzuki Wataru is from Ministry of Environment. So Wataru-san, yep. Yeah, you can say it.
ご紹介いただきました、環境省生物多様性戦略推進室の鈴木でございます。閉会挨拶の機会いただき誠にありがとうございます。まず本イベントを、主催されました S21 の、translated. Great. So, S21、環境、研究総合推進費のプロジェクトの皆様、それからIGES、共催者でいらっしゃいます IGES の皆様、竹内理事長にもご参加いただいておりますけれども、東京大学土木学会、そして土木学会の環境委員会の皆様に心より、敬意を表したいと思います。またご登壇されましたキャロリン・ランドクイスト様、ポール・リードリー様、キャリー・ピーターソン様、それからローラ・ペレリア様におかれました貴重な話題提供やご議論いただき誠にありがとうございました。じゃあちょっとだけ英語でIt is already a privilege for us to have those library discussion as well as very advanced and presentations without time difference. It is very privileged for us. However, my office is too close to this venue, and also today is too close to the end of our fiscal year. So we some of us has some confliction, but still we really appreciate your presentations, and I really hope that you could bring back some cases from Japan, Minami Sanriku, and other presentations, and also continue your valuable advice to this S-21 project. Paul already mentioned your concern. The end of the project is the end of model, but this is different. This S-21 project is closely linked to Japan Biodiversity Outlook. And the JBO is linked to the evaluation of the implementation of our NBSAP and GBF. So please do not worry too much, but maybe you need to encourage us to keep this work going. Thank you. So,で、日本語に戻りますね。すいません。I will speak in Japanese. So, 2023年から開始されました、この S21 プロジェクト、ですけれども、生物多様性とその社会経済学的なものをこう統合的に扱う研究課題ということで、非常に画期的な戦略研究プロジェクトと言えると思います。また、先ほどもご紹介ありましたけれども、イプベスでも、ネクサス、それからトランスフォーマティブチェンジという2つの、アセスメントが、最近採択されまして、その主要な執筆者にもこの S21 の研究者が貢献されています。それからイプベスのシナリオモデルタスクフォースのTSU を IGES がホストしていただいてまして、そういった面での貢献などもこのプロジェクトの中でいい形で融合しているのかなというふうに思います。またですね、こういったその国際的な科学と生物多様性政策のリンケージを南三陸、それから佐渡、大阪といった国内のローカルな地域の政策につなぐというふうな取り組みは非常に画期的なものだと思っておりまして、イプベスとか国家戦略が打ち出している社会変革をどういった形でそういった地域、それから国のレベルで実施していくのかっていう面で、私たちも非常に注目しているものでございます。このプロジェクトそのものは5つのテーマの、プロジェクトを実施してるんですけれども、こういったその、国際アドバイザリー、それから国内のアドバイザリー、それからその、テーマ間の連携のプロジェクト、ミーティングですね。こういったものをこう積み重ねて、それで分野連携、そういうポリシーメーカーとのコンサルテーションを推進していまして、多くの研究者のご協力のもと、政策への反映を目指しているというふうなものです。先ほど少し下手な英語でも申し上げましたけれども、現在環境省の方で、作成しております日本の生物多様性、それから生態系サービスの総合評価、JBO にもたくさんの、研究者の方、それからデータを活用させていただいてます。また昨年コロンビアで開催されました COP16 のサイエンスフォーラムでもこのプロジェクトの研究成果とかこれに関連する国の政策を発表させていただく機会が、ありましてとてもいいディスカッションができたというふうに考えています。このような政策形成に貢献する、アウトプットを見据えた研究が進んでいるということを非常に心強く考えております。2025年度はS21 の中間年、折り返しとなりますので、出口を見据えた研究が進むように、私どもも協力していきたいというふうに考えています。S21 プロジェクトの成功と、本日、ご参加の皆様の、ますますのご発展を記念しまして、閉会のご挨拶させていただきます。本日は誠にありがとうございます。Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Wataru-san. So now we would like to finish this symposium. Thank you very much, all the speakers.